Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are talking about the arc of civilization and trying to glean some gems from the past about how things have gone, about the ascendancy of one civilization from the next, and hopefully get some grip on what happens next in the world. So it's a little bit of a crystal ball experience, and we try to make sense of our times today through the lens of the past. And to guide us through that is Ben Landau Taylor, who is an analyst and writer, and he seems to spend most of his time looking back upon the arc of known civilizations. So in particular, we're going to be digging into the Chinese medieval civilization and looking at the kind of stagnations that occurred towards the end and trying to find some parallels in our modern landscape. There's a central idea at the root of all of this, which is the progression of an instrument of expansion, production, into an institution which has ossified and essentially exists to take care of its creators, but isn't really moving things forward for the civilization by and large. And we're going to apply that to everything that we can dig up across history and in the future and today.
And if you like what we do, consider coming over to patreon.com, where you can support us by giving us a small monthly donation. And I have to tell you that if you do this, it means the absolute world to us, because we really genuinely believe that it is possible to produce something of value without having to attach the sale of some tchotchke to it. I want to live in a world where people can make things that are beautiful and interesting and enlightening without also having to sell beer koozies or whatever the hell is the momentary craze. And so by coming over to patreon.com, you get to demonstrate to the world that it is in fact possible for people to make interesting things and be supported solely under power of that. Number two, you get to join our weekly patron chat, which is one of my favorite communities on the internet. We get together once a week and kind of talk about what people are thinking about. We've started recording these and putting them on the Patreon, so even if you don't come, you get to listen to a conversation that lasts about an hour where lots of different perspectives are represented, and we discuss topics that we've done on the show. We discuss things that people have been reading and they bring to the group, so it's very, very cool. If you don't have any cash to spare right now, that is totally fine. We would love it if you could subscribe, comment, recommend the podcast to a friend. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Discord, Instagram, TikTok, basically any platform that has a search bar you can type Demystify Sci into, and you will find us. Leave a comment, give us a good review in the podcast stores. Every little bit helps the podcast grow, and ultimately, our growth is directly related to how good of guests we can get, because whether or not I like it, we live in a world of hierarchies. And so somebody looks at how many subscribers we have, they look at what rating we have on the Apple Store or whatever, and that's what goes into their decision about whether or not they're going to come on the show. And so if you like us and you want to help us, do any of those things. And
you could also grab a t-shirt down below. And I would also love to hear from you guys what kind of t-shirts you would like to see, because
they're not
always
exactly
rolling around in my head about what the coolest conversation starter would be for Demystify Sci. So if an image comes to mind, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your ideas.
Agreed.
Otherwise, yeah, enjoy this wide-ranging conversation about the arc of civilization, and see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
You recommended this Caroll Quigley book to us that seems in some ways foundational, where Quigley's criticizing Toynbee a lot, which is interesting because Toynbee is a name that I come across all the time when I'm trying to dig into the history of ancient and classical civilizations, and I haven't actually read Toynbee, but it was interesting to see a critique of that. But you've been fixated on medieval history recently, is that right?
Yeah, so recently I've been doing a lot of research into medieval Chinese economic history, especially from around 600 to 1200 AD, yes. And I've done some looking into medieval European history before that also.
What got you interested in medieval Chinese history?
So a lot of it started with basically trying to check Quigley's work in The Evolution of Civilizations, which you were mentioning. Because so there's a lot of these sort of rise and fall of civilizations type theories that are out there. Toynbee did his, there's this Spangler has a popular one. There's tons of these. It's a topic that people like to think about with good reason. Quigley's is my favorite, but as in his book, he's pretty much talking about civilizations in the lineage of Western civilization are the ones where he really goes into detail and explains how they fit the theory. And I've read so many of these where the author is looking at, one civilization or three civilizations, and their theory fits the one that they're looking at specifically. Ibn Khaldun in the Muqaddimah explains how civilizations rise and fall based on, the desert nomads coming in to replace the dynasty. This is a really good theory for the Islamic civilizations. It doesn't really tell you about other people who don't border all of those desert tribes. So I wanted to know, is his theory as general as he's saying it is, or does it only describe, this narrower set of cases that he's looking at? So I wanted to look at something outside of his data set and see if it fit. And medieval Chinese civilization was a good one that he, has 3 sentences or something about in the book, and had just been a kind of big gap in my understanding of the important history of the world. So that was a good jumping off point. So I spent about a year, reading a bunch what I could find about that. There's a lot of really good work that Western scholars have done English language stuff in the mid 20th century. So
what did you find? This is a huge question, but did you find differences between those Western, or maybe it's a better way to ask this is, were there similar narratives amongst all of these scholars of traditional Western rise and collapse that were not seen in your Eastern studies?
So I think I found that it matched the Quigley model pretty well. I was going into it, and it basically passed my checks on that front. I think if you're coming in with looking at it from the Toynbee perspective, so to oversimplify a little bit, Quigley and Toynbee see very similar stages that things go through. Quigley's, in his book, he says that he's drawing his 7-stage model mostly from Toynbee. But Quigley sees it as driven mostly by economics, and Toynbee sees it as driven by the sort of spiritual, civilizations are challenged and then they rise to the challenge or fail to rise to the challenge. And it's hard to tell the story of, the medieval Chinese civilization arising around 600, I would claim, and then disintegrating by 1900 or so. It's hard to tell that story in terms of here is the challenge that they're responding to in a way that is different from the previous, the ancient Chinese civilization, the Zhou dynasty and the Han dynasty and those guys. Whereas if you take the economics perspective, then I think it holds together quite well.
Can you explain this spiritual challenge idea? It's supposed to be unique for each civilization?
Yeah, so I don't think this is right, but Toynbee's theory is that civilizations arise in the face of challenges, where for the Polynesians, it's sort of the challenge of navigating the Pacific Ocean, or it might be the challenge of pressure from some invader or some sort of climate challenge. And then as they rise to the challenge, this sort of forms the kind of the spiritual basis of how that civilization comes together. Which I don't think this is right, because you can sort of always look around and find some sort of challenge that is going on that people are either responding to or failing to respond to. I don't think it's predictive. I don't think it ends up distinguishing what one type of situation from another. It's not something you can take this lens and use it to make prior predictions before you know all of how the history goes. It's sort of a narrative you can only hang on things after the fact. And so his analysis of the stages that civilizations go through are quite good. And a lot of what Quigley did was sort of taking that framework and being okay, but if you put it on this other foundation, then you can tell much more of a causal story of how things go in a way that I think is much better at not just sort of putting a narrative on things from the past, but at explaining what happens and why. And
Quigley makes a really. He seems obsessed with the difference between knowledge and understanding. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So, he has his whole thing at the beginning of the book of like a lot of the analogies about how he thinks about social science from his time in the physical sciences, where, you have to come in with a big collection of facts. You have to have those facts. You have to know what in particular happened. But that is not the same as having a theory of like why things happened, how they all fit together, which things are important, which things are epiphenomenal, which is upstream, which is downstream. So it's a little bit like, so Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks a lot about like pre-paradigmatic science, where people are running around doing experiments, sort of collecting a bunch of facts and a bunch of, if you do this with this apparatus, then you'll get that result. And they don't really have an overall paradigm that explains what's happening and why. So they'll be like, here's some machine that we think does something with air pressure, but we don't really understand what air pressure is. That's maybe not even a term that we have. But we notice that like these are the measurements we're getting out. And then after a while, I don't remember if there's like a story of exactly where the paradigm and the sort of understanding and the framework comes in but like then you have not just a bunch of facts, but also a theory which can explain the facts, which is like at least a better explanation than you had before. And one of the things I love about Quigley's approach is that he is, not just looking at here's a bunch of particular things that happened in whatever period I'm looking at, but like, why do they fit together? Why did it happen this way? Which things are primary? Which things are just sort of like the noise, and trying to understand, which things can be known about the structure of society, which things are chances, I think a very important question if you're trying to study these things, because you're never going to be able to get a perfect prediction of everything, and how much can be known and which things are unexplainable really depends on what type of understanding you're coming in with, because a better theory, more of it will be explainable stuff and less of it will be, I don't know, people are complicated and they do weird things sometimes.
So then with that in mind, and the need for a theoretical framework that lets you piece all of these details together into something that is predictive, I guess, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're studying the rise and fall of civilizations while living in either Britain or America, what you're really trying to understand is, are we doomed? I feel
yes.
like. So if that's the case, and we have these two different foundational perspectives, which is Quigley and Toynbee, we've established that one has an economic theory, one has a spiritual theory of how the rise and the fall happens, but I still don't have a good sense of what exactly the different genesis is. Like I don't have a picture in my head of what are the economic forces that give rise to what ends up turning into a civilization, and what are the spiritual forces, and
how do those fit into the 7 stages too?
And how do those fit into the 7 stages and presumably eventually into collapse? Like, I know that that's a huge question. That's probably like the entirety of the research project you've been doing, but I wonder if you can't give us a 30,000 view so that 30,000 foot view, so we can at least have a framework for how all these pieces fit together as we move forward, so we know roughly what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, so I will give you the 30,000 foot answer for Quigley's economic theory. It's been a while since I've read Toynbee, and to be frank, I don't think it perfectly held together all that well, so I'm kind of going to gloss over that one. But to, violently oversimplify Quigley's theory, the main thing to be looking at any part of this process that he that he describes is what he calls the instrument of expansion, which I think is kind of a clunky term. I think of it often as the economic engine, where what he's looking at, whatever you want to call it, is in any civilization, there is going to be the accumulation of surplus wealth. But that's not a thing that is like evenly distributed over the whole of society. There's going to be something that is by far the most important way that wealth is accumulated. And there's going to be a social class that ends up being the ones who get most of it. So our current civilization, the main economic engine is industrial capitalism. People operate machines, the operation of the machines produces surplus wealth, and then this wealth gets invested in ways that, on average, produce further wealth and, produce technological advance. And that is the economic engine which has been driving our civilization for the last, 200, 250 years or so. And then if you look at something like, if you look at what was going on in, say, 1100, then at that point, the economic engine was feudalism. It was this, manorial landlord class was appropriating the surplus of agriculture and accumulating that, and then they were able to direct that into expansion, into creating new manors, into conquering the French or whatever it was. And so any civilization is going to have one of these. It's not the only thing happening economically. People still today, there is agriculture, there is plenty of people making money in ways that are not industrial capitalism, but the big thing, the way that the biggest fortunes are made, the most politically significant ones, the source of most of the wealth that we have comes from this, and the others are, secondary at best. And so you want to track what is going on with the structure of this instrument of expansion, where in particular, when it first arises, it tends to be much more focused on whatever the economically productive activity is, on, farming, and, your knights and lords are going to be most focused on organizing their peasants and on fighting and defending their peasants. And then over time, what's going to happen with any instrument of expansion is that it's going to start to ossify, and it's going to start to, the social structure around it is going to turn more towards serving entrenched interests and protecting special privileges rather than doing the thing that is ostensibly their job. The knights are going to spend, more time jousting and trying to negotiate the marriage alliances so that they can get a claim on this earldom or whatever, and things that are sort of not the core activity that they're supposed to be doing within this productive structure. And this is a gradual process, which is what takes a civilization out of one of the third stage in this sort of 7-stage way he cuts it up, of this sort of age of expansion, and leads to rising internal conflict within the civilization. And at that point, what usually happens is that eventually these tensions they build and build, and eventually, as it gets further and further ossified, it basically passes a threshold and becomes just sort of long-term stagnant. And then as it's long-term stagnant, it eventually decays slowly until it can no longer really hang together and resist pressure from outside. And then, the Germans start pouring across the rivers and taking apart the Roman Empire, or the Europeans show up with a small handful of gunboats and knock over your empire. But it's because your thing is internally too weak that someone else can come in from outside and sort of lightly blow on the Jenga tower and knock it over. It is possible, when your instrument is partially ossified, for it to be circumvented by a different economic engine. So when feudalism ossified, it did not go all the way. Western civilization did not collapse. It ended up getting circumvented by commercial capitalism and sort of long distance trade. And then that had a good run, and then it eventually ossified and was circumvented by industrial capitalism. So we're on the third instrument of expansion of our own that our Western civilization has had. But that is fairly unusual, and most of the time when it ossifies, it will more often than not lead you into the sort of like the stagnation gets to the point where it is too deep to pull out of it.
I've been reading the last few nights a lot about the Crusades in Europe, which is really interesting. And one of the things that I can't find a great answer for is the motivation for them outside of just, obviously people made money off of it. And, there's this narrative that they wanted to recapture the Holy Lands because, of course, the church and the state were in some sense unified. But when you mentioned that people turn to especially the lords start to turn to protection of their privileges over their expansionary mechanism. It seems, do you think that the Crusades are a good example of the central state trying to turn those aggressions as opposed to being internal towards something outward? And if so, is that, playing out in terms of foreign wars for our own civilization today, where we're trying to sort of take those idle wheels and put them back into the expansion phase as opposed to people fighting amongst each other internally, whether it's economically or physically?
Yeah, so I think that's going to depend a lot on which crusade you're looking at. So I think the description you're giving seems pretty accurate for a bunch of the later crusades, especially the ones that were like directed internally, where you would get the Pope's dispensation to go after a bunch of heretics in southern France or something. But if you look at like the First Crusade, those look fairly different to me, and those look like, I think they are much more explainable by religious fervor, where you will often get like, they're not just sending a bunch of their lords. It is often like the kings are going out and personally leading the army in the Holy Land, and it ends up being, if you zoom out from the states and sort of look at it as like a clash of civilizations type thing, which, you can look at it as there is this pressure from the Islamic civilization on the Western civilization, and Western civilization sort of, it looks like it's at a disadvantage here because it's so fragmented. But then they end up coordinating so that all of these very distant states, they're not like a single unified empire, like, the Chinese dispatching a bunch of people from the south to go face the horse barbarians on the north. They end up with this religious system, which I think was by no means inevitable, by which you can get like, King Richard going from England to personally lead armies in like, in the Middle East. And this seems like it's largely motivated by, just a strong religious belief in, and the belief in like Christendom as a thing that they believed was worth protecting. And a lot of these, were descended from the sort of like, Norman Viking type tradition, who were very warlike people, who were, sailing around from Scandinavia and like conquering bits of like Italy and the Mediterranean. They loved, very wide-ranging conquest. They were, putting up a dynasty in Russia, and it was not a very hard sell to get them to try to go crusade and carve out another kingdom. This is what these people loved to do.
And yet it seems to have had this unifying effect, though, which is quite interesting to me. The church. Do you think that it centralized the power of the church in some sense?
I would expect so. I haven't looked into the history of the papacy in a lot of detail, but it's the sort of thing you have to have rather a lot of centralized authority to be able to do something like that in the first place. But yeah, I would have to look over at the timing of how that interacted with a lot of the Pope's struggles with the Holy Roman emperors, which were often sort of like, the big thing in their backyard. But I haven't looked at those two timelines side by side in a lot of detail, and that would be very interesting.
As I recall, the Germans, the Prussians, were very reluctant to get on board initially because there was all these internal disputes going on, and then as the Crusades, unfolded, that they were actually participating more and more. But I'm not an expert at all.
I forget which crusade it was that one of the Holy Roman emperors ended up drowning, crossing a river.
That's right.
While leading a campaign.
Mysterious circumstances. Yeah. He went to take a bath or something and never came back. It was kind of it's very strange.
Yeah, there's a lot of whenever some, king or whatever has an accidental death, you always have to wonder whether it's really accidental, because presumably some of them are, but you never know for sure which ones.
Yeah, there's 4 different accounts that all conflict. It's very strange. It's like Frank Olson.
Something is rotten in the state of the papacy. So I'm trying to really tease apart this idea of economic expansion and a spiritual goal, because it seems like Shiloh's example of the Crusades kind of starts to blend or blur that line, because instead of having just this desire for more property, more feudal farmland, more of anything else, you have this internal spiritual construction that drives not just the expansion, but the unification of a disparate group of people. Like you said, you have the kings of England that are leading armies for a larger spiritual goal. And so spirit and economics tends to blend in these situations. And as you're talking about these economic drivers that have sustained, let's say, Western civilization, where we go from feudalism to this expansion capitalism through the colonization and empires to industrial capitalism, I'm like, is the spiritual principle at play that everybody loves money? And so they're just driven by whatever will allow them to just accumulate more goods? Or is that just a deeply naive read on the situation? Because it doesn't seem like God is necessarily at the forefront of whatever's been happening for the last 200 years.
Yes. And so, the place I disagree with Toynbee is in his claim that the spiritual is sort of the main thing that's driving these trends. But I definitely think the spiritual is a very important piece of how a society operates. And it's something you have to pay a lot of attention to if you want the overall story. These things all affect each other quite strongly. So you can't really, whenever you're studying social science, you have to study the whole thing. You can't study only the spiritual in isolation, only the political in isolation, only the economics in isolation. But I think the thing that ends up being a very important consequence of Quigley's theory is that the economic is sort of the primary driver. And that when you have the economic expansion, this sets the stage for the reason that these people can, it's because they're expanding and things are going well and economically things are growing and they're becoming more powerful, that they sort of have this space that they can get away with. Oh, I'm going to go sail all the way over to Jerusalem, where but it's because the economic, they're in it, the economic expansion lays the foundation for expansions in terms of the frontiers from conquests, the more successful, I guess some of the earlier crusades against the Islamic world and some of the later crusades in the sort of Slavic area crusades. And it sets this, and it sort of sets this, it gives it's the thing that powers the military in these cases. It's the thing that sort of, if you look spiritually at what's going on in the Dark Ages in 500 AD or whatever, people are much more trying to cope with this sort of sense that everything is falling apart and being destroyed. And if you look at, the city of God is much more, how do we deal with living in a fallen kind of post-apocalyptic world? because the sort of economic foundations are all falling apart at that time. And which then leads to a bunch of political turmoil. Whereas by the time of the Crusades, it's like they are firing on all cylinders. It's a powerful civilization. They can walk around flexing, and then there's a question of how does that get channeled, which, this is not a perfectly predetermined thing. You can't do any sort of like Isaac Asimov psychohistory stuff on this, but that is the terrain on which the Pope is able to do moves like call for a crusade and have it like. It actually ended up working a lot better than the Pope was expecting. He was kind of like, whoa, like I did not think that was going to happen. But so I see the economic as, all of the things are connected and affecting each other. But I think the economic one is the sort of major driver which sets the pace for the others on this sort of civilizational trend.
It's almost the thing that grants you the ability to make good on your plans, because without it, you can plan all you want, but if you don't have the gold stores or the army that you fed or the
banking structure too, I wanted to just really quickly point out that this is the rise of banking as well during the Crusades, which is quite interesting.
Interesting, I didn't know that. But I think that holds, that as long as you have the economic basis, you can do stuff. And as soon as that starts to fall apart, you might have plans or desires, but there's just no ability to organize this vast quantity of people into this directed thrust of whatever project you've decided to take on. And so it makes sense that economics serves as the foundation upon which the spiritual plays out to some degree. But it has to come down to what can you actually do? What is the motive force that you have behind your will?
Yes, very much so. And a big way that this plays out is like the rate of expansion ends up being a big determiner of how much infighting you get between the elites. Because when things are working well, then if you are mostly working together and mostly sort of doing the thing that your job is supposed to be, then everyone's getting richer and you're getting the things that you feel like you need and your society has told you to expect. And in the early days, that's going at a particular fairly fast rate. And then if it slows down, then people are like, wait a minute, I was expecting that I would get these other things when I was older, but that doesn't look like it's on track by just, doing the normal stuff.
That sounds familiar.
That you're supposed to. Yeah. This is, in more recently, this has sort of come back under the term embedded growth obligations. I've heard being thrown around for basically the same idea of like, if you've got these obligations to grow within your society, and that's sort of like, oh yes, we're expecting a interest rate of whatever, so that like you can hit these milestones and like be living in a house by that age, and be a vice president or whatever it is you're expecting. And if that's on track, then everything's great. And if that's not on track, then people are going to look around and be like, hey, wait a minute. If I can't do this by doing the sort of like, naive story of what it says sort of on the pro-social description, then maybe I can get those things with more infighting. And then that ends up being a self-reinforcing process, because you get more and more attention turned towards the internal infighting and the internal jockeying for rank, and relatively less on whatever activity is leading the expansion in the first place.
Can we look at like specifically how, I know that we're getting out of order here, but how that seems like a familiar situation. Like I was just joking just now, but how does infighting play out in the modern world? Is it just increased competition for jobs, or is it like actual aggression amongst members of the society on a just street level, or how would we experience that? How would we take note of it today? Because we're obviously not taking up arms against our neighbors, for over territory today in the modern world.
Well, less than we did at many points in the past, anyway.
Oh, fair enough. I'm just talking about here in Oregon. There's not a lot of that, but yeah, in the world at large, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So you see, there's just a huge amount of effort that goes into like trying to get like political privileges and trying to. So I think if you look at medicine, is a really straightforward case of this, where like the number of doctors who can be trained in the US is limited by law. They're like, this is the cap. You can't have more than that. That is in order to preserve wages for doctors. So that is, a type of, in order to fight for a bigger slice of the pie by lowering production and keeping that up. This is a very common type of move. It was especially with how the commercial capitalism, the sort of second instrument that Western civilization, like you saw much, much more of, those sort of cartel moves. You see, stuff like tariffs of like, oh, that other country is getting too much of the benefit of, whatever thing. So we have to change the laws so that we get more of, the benefit of this thing that's being built. In extreme cases, you can get like imperialist wars, and but that is something that we have, and it looks to me like, the beginning of the sort of the stage 4, the what Quigley calls the age of conflict, like World War I looked like basically the beginning of that for Western civilization, which was, largely provoked by, there's a question of whether their economics was actually good, whether the people who were like, oh yes, we need to fight for more colonies in order to become richer, they may have just been totally wrong about that, but that was a big part of the motivation that sparked, that conflict, was that they felt like they needed to have, control of the sea lanes and colonies overseas. So that's the sort of more extreme case, but you will often see much more of like, oh, we need to make sure that like, the way we're going to have what we need is less by making something that increases the amount of goods and services in society, and much more by fighting so that we can like get the student debt paid off from the government, or get the government to send more transfer payments to this class of people and less to that class of people, which I'm not part of, because we need them to be able to send them to my guys. We need them to, like we need like the like more transfer payments for this special industry needs its carve out, and like this group of like mothers between the ages of 27 and 29 needs its carve out, and like more energy going into that stuff relative to
like more regulation,
production itself,
more central planning, more just strong arming events away from perhaps their natural course. It sounds like, if I'm trying to summarize what you're saying.
Yes, I would. Natural course is not exactly the way I would say it, but I think we're talking about the same thing here. Yes.
Shiloh, what do you mean by natural course?
It just seems like these economic systems are going to play out. All right, so one that came up a lot in the recent election was this tariff thing, right? And I think that with the goal of making more production occur inside of our country, Trump was campaigning that he was going to restrict external production through tariffs. And later I heard Elon saying that he thought this was, not only impossible, but perhaps counterproductive unless it's unleashed with a really long timetable. Because if you restrict certain parts from being produced and we don't have the capacity to do them, then you're really just slowing down innovation at home while you do that sort of thing. But it seems like this heavy-handed move to try to restrict the reason I say natural is just because what would otherwise be a sort of free market situation, you pay for the cheapest labor wherever you can get it. And by restricting that, you force it to occur domestically. So you get your economic benefit by forcing it to happen, as opposed to, encouraging growth locally, which is also kind of forcing it to happen, but it just seems more like fertilizing versus strong arming to me.
To take this in a really slightly different direction, as you're talking about the natural order, the natural direction that things would unfold, I'm immediately struck by the idea of whether or not civilizations are even a natural way for things to unfold, because I'm kind of used to the idea that if something is quote unquote natural, it is inherently stable. It's some confirmation that people or animals or ecosystems fall into and are perfectly able to maintain. Like, you have stories of when you go digging in the tropics, you discover that the forests that cover Borneo appear to have been there for 40 million years. And I'm like, the idea that a civilization could last for 40 million years is laughable. And so is this entire structure of economic gamesmanship and trying to organize coalitions to keep the barbarians at bay and to nurture all this economic growth, is this just something that's fundamentally fragile and prone to collapse and inherently unnatural?
So I think that
I
civilization.
deeply regret using that word now. I'm so sorry to everybody. I'll never use the word natural ever again. It's just such a problematic word.
I think this is. I'm really glad you did, because so if I can get philosophical a moment before I answer your question, I think the question of what is natural and like sort of what the way I think of that is, what is the default course given sort of the way a system works? What is the way that things will sort of play out most of the time with rules sort of like this? And that's a really useful concept, which I use in a lot of my thinking. And to be able to look at a social system and be like, okay, yes, this is the sort of thing you should often expect. This is a natural formation given the inputs, versus when you look at something and be like, wait a minute, that one looks funny. That's kind of unnatural. Something is holding it in an unnatural position. I need to go look and figure out what is holding it in that unnatural position, is a move that I use quite a lot. So from that perspective, I think of civilizations as extremely natural. That is a type of system that arises over and over and over and over again. When you look at humans, like there's like a couple of dozen civilizations that we know about, and we keep discovering more older ones. I think it's like every decade for the last almost 100 years, we've discovered a new lost or like previously lost ancient civilization. I strongly suspect that civilization is much older than our current archaeological records, and we'll keep sort of finding more and pushing it further and further back. But it does seem so. I think so. They are so. I would say that they are natural and they are very stable. Like they will often last more than 1,000 years, and that's like quite a long time. They are mortal. A lot of natural things are mortal. Like having like a bird is natural, and it is a lot less stable than a civilization. It'll live for like single-digit years, maybe 10 years, but it is not, it is fragile in the sense that it will eventually, decay and stop working, just like a civilization will on a much longer time scale. But I think that being mortal and sort of fragile in that sense doesn't make it unnatural, and it is not the only natural organization of people. Like, I think so. Like people always sort of naturally structure into societies, but they aren't always the sort of cities and writing and hierarchies thing that I think of like as civilizations. There's like, tribal societies and stuff, but civilizations is a type of human society that keeps arising. Notably, they didn't just arise in the old world. When the Europeans got to the Americas, they saw that like, oh, the Americans have civilizations too, and like North America was mostly tribal by that point. But like, this is a thing which evolved independently on both of the big land masses, which suggests to me that it is a very natural and pattern for people to fall into, which then will last for. Like, I can't think of any civilization that lasted for less than 1,000 years. So that seems pretty stable to me, even if they definitely are mortal.
The shared fragility, like I wonder how far we can push that analogy between biological life and death and civilization scale life and death. Because death is something we spend a lot of time thinking about from a biological standpoint, in opposition to life, like trying to understand what life is, because there's obviously not a really robust definition of life that scientists use. It's a very circular definition. It's like a chemical system that obeys Darwinian evolution. And you're like, well, what's Darwinian evolution? And they're like, it's something that organisms do. You're like, what's an organism? They're like, it's something that's alive. And then you're just like, good God, we haven't actually said anything. So there's something really interesting here when we think about the process of dying for an organism, which is the accumulation of errors, the inability to repair itself. How many of these qualities do we see happen at the civilization scale? Like, how much can we really push that analogy? Do you think it's a really good analogy that is completely congruent with an organism?
Certainly not. I think that it is. I think of it more as a metaphor than a like load-bearing analogy. Like there's when you sort of take it in a sort of poetic way, then it can gesture at the right things pretty well. But when you start trying to look really finely for congruences, it often starts to break down. And there's a lot of these people who look at these things. They like to talk about old civilizations that are sort of like decrepit and low energy, and like young civilizations with the vitality of youth. And I think that is more confusing than illuminating. It is and if you look structurally at what's going on, like it doesn't really look like the things that we think of as like old age and youth or decrepitude in people. And there's a lot of ways, like one of the really big differences, for example, is how they die. Like when a biological organism dies, then like it's basically gone, and there's some organic matter that can be used by other organisms as a resource in a bunch of ways, but it's pretty undifferentiated. And if you can't really, it doesn't really matter whether you've got the remains of a human or an ant or whatever. Like whatever uses that corpse is going to be completely different. The inputs sort of don't matter. Whereas when you look at how civilizations die and like the things that come out of their remains, it's completely different. There's much, much more continuity. Like if you're looking at Western civilization, a lot of it, in fact, depends on the classical civilization, which is like the main thing that we came from. Like it is much less of a, well, that one's dead and something is just using it as undifferentiated fuel. Like there's a lot of very important like disanalogies from anything biological.
The thing that makes me think of is birth and reproduction. Like is the baby of the next civilization born before the death of the previous one?
Especially if you consider writing and artifacts that are left over, which then serve as the grounds for political commentary and mythology and everything else.
Yeah, so the normal thing you see is that the, descendant civilization arises several hundred years after the final death of its precursor. And it usually arises, so geographically, it usually arises at what had been the frontier of the previous one ends up being the core of the new one. So like the core of classical civilization was the Mediterranean, Greece, Rome, and sort of Northern Europe was this frontier where like, Julius Caesar was fighting against the barbarians and so forth. And then sort of Northwestern Europe ends up being the core of the successor. Or if you look at, the Chinese history, the ancient Chinese civilization had its core on the Yellow River in the north, with the Yangtze River as sort of this, frontier area on the border, kind of a backwater. And then when you see the medieval Chinese civilization arise, the Yangtze River in the south is the core where most of the people are, where most of the economic activity is. So there are patterns, but so it ends up, the area that had been the frontier ends up usually being where the new one is. And you do get this admixture process where you'll get like 2 or 3 civilizations sort of coming together, and you'll have sort of, people have often described Western civilization as arising from like the combination of the Germanic and the Roman as sort of the two things that got mixed together to produce the ethos that the medieval stuff was coming out of in those days. And that's that type of admixture is a very common input into new civilizations.
So basically,
you can kind of look at it as being like parents, except there can be more than 2 sometimes.
So the Mars colonies will be the next dominator civilization, by this model.
It's interesting because I was immediately thinking not of Mars, but of Silicon Valley. Because California was definitely the frontier 200 years ago. It was the place.
Well, that's the present, right? I'm thinking, like, what's in the future?
Why?
What's the new frontier? What's the next frontier?
I have this feeling that it hasn't totally shifted to California yet, or to Silicon Valley, or to tech. Like tech is booming and its tendrils are everywhere, but I think that we have not yet seen the peak of what that's going to look like another 50 to 100 to 200 years from now. Because we're just at this, I mean, the internet is what, 40 years old? All of the technologies that are reshaping the way that the world works are being born in this one specific place, and we haven't seen them fully take over yet. And so Mars might be a frontier, but we're so far from Mars as a possibility right now that it seems like we still have another arc to play out before we get to Mars, which might very well be eventually where we get to.
Yeah, and so the Californian stuff, I think we definitely have quite a ways to see it play out. I think it is within Western civilization. I don't look at it as a new civilization. I look at it as sort of a wave of newly rich economic elites within the Western paradigm. And yeah, like what you see with a lot of these is when they get rich and there's sort of these crass people who don't really fit into the social structure and don't have political power for a while at first. And then over time, they, you know, as they become less of the new kid on the block, as they start, you know, getting involved in the political system, as they start, people just sort of acculturating to them. The newly rich people eventually sort of become the old rich people, and I think the Silicon Valley people are going through that process, and especially in the last like 4 years, have been like, wait a minute, like we are actually in a position to, you know, start wielding political power that is commensurate with our economic influence. And they certainly seem to have been more involved in this election as like an active force rather than making themselves available as a resource for politicians. But I don't think of that as like the genesis of a new civilization. Where I'm actually looking at that, where I think there's a possibility of it happening now, which, hard to be sure, come back in 150 years and ask me and I'll be able to tell you if I was right, is a lot of East Asia, where it seems like, you know, places like Japan, South Korea, even China to an extent, are doing a sort of a mixture of, you know, Chinese civilization and Western civilization seem to be sort of swirling together, and it's not totally clear exactly how that's going to shake out. But I would not be surprised at all. I think it's more likely than not that we are seeing the rise of a new civilization in that region.
Interesting. Can you sketch that out a little bit more? Like what countries, what do you see as being the seeds?
So there's sort of two different things going on. One of which is, you know, it looks like, you know, so the previous sort of medieval Chinese civilization seems to have been just totally disrupted by like the early 1900s. But it does seem like there is a new thing that is coming together there, where they are figuring out a way that is, you know, it descends from the way it descends from medieval Chinese civilization in the same way that our thing descends from classical civilization. There's a huge amount of influence, but it is, you know, they've got their instrument of expansion. They just took industrial capitalism from the West and they've got it working. They've got a political system that is, you know, very much tuned to the new economic model that they have. And they are like in the process of figuring out how that can work over the long term, especially since the 80s or so. It seems like they've been like getting a political, economic, cultural model where like these things are starting to work together, and it seems plausibly like, you know, they're figuring out how to have this sort of long-term economic like expansion as the foundation of a cohesive and distinctive civilization. The other thing I'm looking at is there's a economic tradition that descends from Japan, where they figured out a really good way of doing like effective industrial policy, having the state in a way that is, you know, less centrally controlled than China, than like communism, but having the state sort of, oh, if we use tariffs in this way so that we're not just arbitrarily shutting down a competition, but it's like we have identified that we want a steel industry, so we'll put tariffs on steel and then slowly take those away at a kind of predictable rate while doing these other things to like make sure our steel industry gets the expertise they need. Okay, we've got steel, now we're going to do cars. And this has been copied by places like Taiwan, South Korea. For a while, people were talking about the Asian tigers. And it looks to me like it is a combination of, there's a lot that is being taken from the West and since World War II, especially from America, but in a way that is not just doing the system that the West does. Like if you look at this type of social organization, it's pretty different from what's happening in Europe. It's pretty different from what's happening in the US. There's a distinct thing that is happening in a bunch of what are politically speaking American client states in East Asia, but are economically and culturally seem like they're doing their own thing. And if they can sort of, the big thing right now, sort of the big question is, it seems like spiritually they are kind of going haywire and the birth rate is falling even faster than it is in the West. And so are they going to be able to figure out that in a way that can let their civilization, their sort of nascent, it looks to me like it's in sort of the earlier like admixture or gestation stages that come before the age of expansion, to use Quigley's framework. Like, can they sort of work that out and stick the landing is, I think, going to be one of the most important questions of the next century or two.
It's interesting. You've got almost like there's two patterns that we've been talking around. One is this waves thing, because on one hand, we trace Western civilization all the way back. You started with the Greeks and the Romans, but I'd say we could go all the way back to the Sumerians, probably.
Absolutely, yes. The Greeks and Romans didn't come from nowhere. They had their precursors too.
And so there's this really interesting arc where you have these waves of rise and fall, and you do have some admixture, which is a different pattern that I see happening, but you also have civilizations like the Incans that just completely disappear, right? And maybe I'm wrong about that, and I haven't spent enough time in Ecuador, but it seems like you do have civilizations that completely disappear, and then you have ones that are reconstituted in a new form. Do you think that that's a fair delineation in terms of two things that can happen?
Yes. In general, I think that there are opportunities for civilizations to arise. I see a lot of history as being like, the natural conditions are such that this thing becomes possible. When the civilization has collapsed and there's no civilization in the area, like, that is an opportunity for something to happen. It is not a guarantee. And then that just ends up depending a lot on the specific people who are there. Like, do they do a good job? Do they, like, are they smart? Are they bold? Are they brave? Are they, like, good at building social structures? And if you do a good job, like, then you can build a thing that lasts a long time. And if you don't do a good enough job, and then in the case of the Incans, I think it was, I don't know, I don't really see them as having had an opportunity, because it seems like, they were, as they were falling, they like got conquered by, by Western civilization in a way that, like, Western civilization was in a really, sort of big, like, was doing pretty hot at the time. And so it's only, it was substantially later that, well, actually, maybe as I think about it, with the communication challenges over the ocean, maybe there was an opportunity, not like the next day, but by 150 years later, by like, that's an interesting question, yeah. How much of an opportunity they had, and how, because it doesn't seem like Western civilization fully incorporated South America. This is, whenever you get anyone classifying the civilizations that exist in the world today, the two areas that always give them trouble is Russia and South America. Are those part of Western civilization or not? So maybe there in fact is enough distance that there was an opportunity there. So it's an interesting question.
I guess I didn't totally just mean the Incas, but the ancestors of the Incans too. So the Tiwanaku is the name of the peoples that preceded them. Like there was this very long-reaching, multi-thousand-year arc that seems culturally similar in the same way we can trace our own civilization to Rome or Greece or something like that.
Yeah, and there's like the Mississippi Valley civilization and like the mega structures there, which have like there's never really been any good archaeological work, but clearly there was something there that by the time the Europeans showed up was long gone. It was all just tribal. So that certainly seems to be a thing that can happen also, yes.
With the arc of Western civilization, I have this feeling that the Middle Ages are not really representative of a different civilization. It's perhaps an economic downturn, it's perhaps a reorganization, but we're so deeply influenced by the Greeks and the Romans that it feels difficult for me to say that we're a separate civilization from them. Like we have cultural differences, obviously, but do you take it to be a steady stream of evolution from ancient Greece to the present day? Or do you think that there is a really distinct cleavage where you can say that, like, absolutely not, these are totally different groups, and there's not a clear evolutionary continuum?
So I think there's a clear evolutionary continuum. I think there is very clear descent. I do think classical civilization and Western civilization are definitely different civilizations. And, there was the, period of, like, let's say, late 400s through about 700 or so, where it seemed like, there just wasn't a coherent civilization going on in Europe. And there's, and the differences between classical civilization and Western civilization are very large. Like both, if you look at the instrument of expansion, the Romans had an instrument of expansion based around slavery, and then you have a long period, which was the same as the Greeks. So that I would say that it was the instrument of expansion for classical civilization as a whole was the sort of manorial slavery, and then there's a long period where there basically is no instrument of expansion. There is not this accumulation of surplus for like a couple hundred years of not the original usage of the Dark Ages as I think it was Plutarch who first coined it, but like the way it's used now for this sort of middle of the first millennium type of deal. And then you do see a new thing arise, which has an instrument of expansion, has a very different ideology than classical civilization. Now it's Christianity, has very different extent. It's no longer based around the Mediterranean world and North Africa and Egypt and like the southern half of what we now think of as Europe. It's it's based around Europe itself, and politically, it's now these decentralized, fairly small kingdoms instead of like a single empire or like a Greek polis. So there's just so many really sharp differences. If you look sort of before versus after the Dark Ages, I think it makes sense to call them different civilizations. But there is very clear descent. Like if you look at why is Western civilization the way that it is, like you are mostly looking at, influence from classical civilization with like a bunch of, especially politically, drawing from the Germanic tribes and especially spiritually and religiously drawing from the sort of Near East. But like the bulk of it is very clearly from classical civilization.
Yeah, it seems like it's obviously harder to say things the further back we go in time, but there's obviously the Greek Dark Ages too, which don't get a lot of play. It's very hard to understand what happened there, but in between, let's say, the Minoan civilization and the rise of classical Greece, there's a similar dark period where...
Yeah, the Bronze Age collapse, as it's often called, yes, which I think is another one of these sort of interregnums between civilizations where, the Greeks very clearly draw a lot from the Mycenaean civilization in the similar way that we draw a lot from the Greeks. But also you have this big disruption, and the thing that comes after later, we know so little about the Mycenaeans, but what we do know about them, it seems like a very different pattern, like economically, politically, spiritually. It seems like there is at least as sharp a break between them and the Greeks as between us and the classical world, to the very limited extent that we can tell things from, like, a few palace frescoes and a few pieces of jewelry that we have from the precursors.
Do you think that the Mycenaean civilization was intertwined with the Canaanites, like the early Canaanite or Phoenician civilization? Were those kind of part of the same thing?
That's, I would be surprised if they were like the same civilization. It's, like I haven't looked as much into the Phoenician architecture, but it doesn't seem. I would be surprised if it were like highly similar to the type of palace structures that we have. I don't know if there's this sort of continuity of art that you would expect.
I think that's one of the main things, is the continuity of art and like the structure of the bull worship and things like this. There's a book I've been meaning to get to that makes this case that they're essentially of the same vein. Because obviously the Phoenician civilization isn't known for its monumental architecture or anything like that. It's kind of this weird civilization that's a mercantile class that's kind of happening in the background. And they do seem to have been doing a lot of the maritime trade operations for the Minoan civilization around the same time.
As they did for many others, yes.
Yeah, for many others, exactly, right? So I don't know. I've always...
like you've looked into this more than I have. I'd be very interested in that book.
Yeah, I'll dig it up for you and send it afterwards. I haven't made it to it. I think the guy's still alive, so maybe we can get him on here to talk about it. But I've always just been fascinated by that maritime civilization, whatever you want to call it, because it's kind of slips through the cracks of all of these classical, pictures of civilization that are usually defined by these archaeological sites of these megalithic architecture or whatever it is. And I've always just wondered who those people are, because then you see the rise of this Canaanite civilization, which also doesn't get too many shout outs compared to, the Egyptians or the Greeks or something like that. But it is certainly playing a really interesting glue in the whole paradigm.
Yeah, and so much of our picture just of history comes from the circumstance of what happens to survive. Because you've got all of these nomadic societies. I have argued about whether to call the Eurasian horse nomads, whether they should be called a civilization or not. But there's so much going on, but we know so little of it because they don't leave artifacts, they don't leave buildings, they don't leave writing. And so it's just this big void in our historical and sociological understanding, not because nothing important is happening there, but because they don't leave any records. So from the perspective, if you imagine someone who can hear but not see, there's only, there's just this whole class of things that they don't really,
there's like an intentional
to experience.
There's an intentional blindness too, right? Sometimes I feel like there's this infliction of blindness, like the descendants of the Canaanites were essentially the Carthaginians, and the Romans hated the Carthaginians and famously tried to essentially erase them from the world, right? Salted Carthage and just stomped it off the map. And so how much of our missing perspective on that civilization is just due to this super psyop to just get rid of them from having ever existed?
It seems almost certain that there would have been, a bunch of libraries in that civilization, which we don't have because the Romans destroyed them. I don't think there's any specific record of that, but I just assume it happens. It's the type of thing the Romans would have done.
Yes, it can be really frustrating trying to understand anything before the classical period, because you just have such little information to piece together a story from.
Yeah, or depending on when and where, if you're looking at what was going on in, Northern Europe in 550 AD, we just have almost nothing. We'll have a couple of priests who are wandering through and telling stories about the songs that are clearly shot through with their own opinion, or even medieval European history. I was so used to looking into medieval European history where people are like, oh, the Domesday Book, this is super famous because we're so glad that we actually have a fairly reliable record of the taxes from 1,000 years ago. And then I go and look at medieval Chinese history and they're like, is that supposed to be exceptional? We've just got all those records because we've got these scholar bureaucrats, that's their job, and like the amount of material, that has like, even with a very small fraction of it having been translated into English, it's just like still just so much, like the quantity of stuff that had been preserved from that time over the past millennium or so is just so much larger than in European history. And this just has, it sort of really drives home how much this depends on sort of what gets preserved. And I've been thinking lately about how to preserve the stuff we have today, because, so much of it is all of this digital stuff, which I just don't really see that, it's hard enough to find a blog from 20 years ago. I'm like, how do we make sure that this stuff is still around in 1,000 years? There's all these projects like the Internet Archive, which are trying to digitally store it, which I love them. I love the work that they do. I think that's really good for keeping a 40-year-old, well, I guess not a 40-year-old blog, but like a 20-year-old blog legible. But
we just took a tour of the place, actually. It was really fun. We went over to the actual physical location and looked at the servers and everything.
Oh, great. Yeah.
But yeah, 1,000 years from now,
that's not, that's not the problem they're trying to solve. They're trying to solve a different problem, and I'm super glad that they are. But yeah, I'm like, so should we just like, take all of the, all of the sort of crown jewels of our digital culture and just like, laser etch them on rock, or just put them in clay tablets? Or is there some sort of like, plexiglass based solution? Like, what's the way that you would actually preserve that so that it'll still be around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that there isn't really a good solution except for some kind of cultural transmission. Like,
legions of songwriters.
I mean, it sounds silly, but there's so much that is being produced. And so you have this organizational challenge of figuring out, well, what part of it is worth preserving? Who decides what gets etched into the stone? And obviously in the past, it was the kings who decided what got etched in the stone. So perhaps that's just the natural arc of history, that there's somebody that has the money and the resources and the desire that they're going to do it. But if you sit down and you think about, okay, well, what are the details that we'll preserve of today? It seems pretty transparently obvious that the details that would get saved would not be the full picture. It would be some really selective subset of the things that the elite who have the access to this sort of technology would want to project into the future. Like, I think about Bezos's like 10,000-year clock or something that he's trying to build in the desert.
It's got it underneath a mountain that he owns, because he's the one who owns a mountain. Yeah. And this is also the same as, all the historical stuff we have. There's just so little that's written about like the peasants or whatever, like it, because it's all from the perspective of the people who, were literate and could afford to support scholars and stuff. And yeah, like all of our history almost is skewed in this way.
Is the accounts from the East, from medieval China that you've been reading, that have this depth of scholarship also skewed in the same direction, do you think? Just by virtue of having so much more of it?
Mostly, yes. Like, it is a slightly different skew just because of the sort of slightly different, like, in the West, it was mostly the priests. You had all these monks who were copying stuff. They were the ones who were, they were the scholars. It was from this particular perspective. And then the sort of scholar class in China was not religious. There were these sort of administrative bureaucrats, they had, in medieval China, you start seeing the rise of like the civil service exams, of how they'll like promote the prefect of this province and stuff like that. So it's a somewhat different lens than you get with the much more religious one that you see in a lot of Western history. But like, yeah, it is an elite class that is part of the administration of government, and they're the ones who are, doing most of the writing. So it is more similar than it is different.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you, if you are enjoying the conversation and you've listened to a couple podcasts, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. By giving us a couple dollars a month, you help us keep the spaceship running, help us make sure that we get better guests, and keep growing the podcast into something that is better and better every single week. So I hope we can see you at patreon.com/demystifysci. When you look at Quigley's estimate of how civilizations rise and fall, is that a general principle that you can apply to all civilizations, or is it something that can only really be applied in this relatively narrow Western lens? And you spent a bunch of time looking into ancient Chinese civilization, medieval civilization, and I wonder what it is that you found. Does it align? Does it not align? Where does the story break down? How does it break down? Where is it strongest?
Yeah, so it looks to me like it aligns, like the Chinese history does fit the theory. So I was going into it trying to test it, and I think it holds up. So, there are still other things, I'd still like to look into, Indian civilization is one that I still don't know enough about to be like, does it match that? But, the thing I was trying to do, I was looking at something outside of Quigley's initial data set, and for that one, it does look like it holds up. So,
he has this idea of like instruments versus institutions.
Yes.
And go ahead.
An institution is like an instrument that has decayed and ossified and become corrupted, basically. Yes.
And so the corruption and the ossification of the instrument into this fragile institution, to me, seems like from my cursory read of medieval Chinese civilization, is that it was a really massively bureaucratic institution.
Yes.
And did it somehow manage to escape the ossification and the corruption that creates this shift from instrument to institution? Or is it that its eventual corruption and ossification is what leads to the downfall of the empire?
Yeah, so it avoided it for a while, but not forever. So one way that I disagree with this sort of common historiography, people usually talk about ancient China and imperial China and then modern China. And I think modern China, I basically agree with this division of putting it after around 1900 or so. You definitely see the breakdown of a civilization around then, and I suspect the gestation of a new one, as I mentioned before. But I think that, so people will put sort of the start of what they call imperial China with the Han Dynasty, unifying China, and then like say that then you have imperial China from about 200 BC to about 1900, which is not the way I think about it. I think of as the Han Dynasty as basically the end of ancient Chinese civilization. It was sort of the last period of political unification, and which then got as it sort of fell apart, and you had like the Three Kingdoms period of civil war, and then the Five Barbarians come in, and that looks to me like the end of ancient Chinese civilization in the way that you have the Germans pouring across the Roman border, or the Europeans showing up in knocking over medieval China. And then around 600 AD, with the Sui dynasty and the Tang dynasty, is what looks to me like the rise of what I'm calling medieval Chinese civilization, which then has this quite long period of expansion, and like you've got your golden ages and the insane build out of the Canal network, which I'll talk about at great length later. Those are, I am blown away by their Canal technology, but we'll get there. And then there's this quite long period of stagnation of, when the Europeans are showing up, they're like, man, these guys are really just kind of stuck. And that had been going on for quite some time. So it's an interesting question, exactly when did it start? But certainly by the 1400s, the thing has really just ossified and turned into an instrument super hard. And the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty are, like, every historian I've ever seen, like the degree of consensus on, yeah, this was a super stagnant period is like, you almost never see that degree of historical consensus about stuff like that.
You said turned into an instrument.
Turned into an institution.
Okay.
To use Quigley's terminology.
That makes more sense.
And so is the stagnation the cause of its inevitable fall, so that by the time that the Europeans show up, there's just no movement available in society for being able to actually respond to something that is a novel threat? Or is it that people on the inside are wanting it to change and are kind of cheering for the fact that things might fall apart? Do you have a sense of that?
It's the first one. It's just the complete inability to adapt, which, you see this in every civilization when it hits this stage. So, like, there was, I think it was in the 1800s, there was a famous letter from the emperor to a British trade delegation, where the British were like, hey, we want to, we're really upset at the way you're treating our merchants. There's like only one port they're allowed to enter in, and like they can only be there half the year. It's a huge pain in the ass, and they're treated really poorly while they're there. And there was all these frictions because whenever the British would send an ambassador, the Chinese would be like, you have to follow all of these etiquette rules. You have to kowtow to the emperor. And the British were like, we're not going to do that. I will bow to you the way I bow to my king. And like often this would mean they wouldn't end up meeting. Sometimes the British would just suck it up. And so they get this letter to the emperor, and his response is basically like, we have everything we need. China's fine. We don't need any of your Western whatchamacallits. Like, we are the center of the universe, and like we don't care about whatever is going on in your British backwater. This is like the height of the British Empire, and it's not too long after this that the British end up, launching the Opium Wars. Is like, a few decades later. So like they're just really not tracking what's going on. They're not able to respond in a way that is very characteristic of, civilizations that have decayed this far. And you can see this really setting in as early as the 1400s, centuries before all this, where there's a pretty striking anecdote, which I think is like, by this point you can be like, all right, so they have definitely set in the sort of ossification where there's the Admiral Cheng Ho, who leads this treasure fleet. They get this massive fleet of ships, which he takes through the Indian Ocean on this voyage of trade and sort of also intimidating a bunch of the states and demanding tribute. And like people are like, yes, here's a bunch of stuff, and like we, acknowledge the supremacy of the emperor. And they go on, I think it's 7 of these voyages, but eventually this gets shut down by the imperial court because it's empowering the wrong faction within the empire. So they ended up just dismantling what was, to that point, the greatest fleet that had ever been built in the history of the world. Just gets taken apart. And that sort of sets the tone for what's happening for about 500 years of whenever something new is happening, it is just getting shut down because it is empowering new people who aren't part of the status quo, and they can't have that.
So how does a place survive for what looks like 500 years with that kind of a mentality? Is there just nobody around? Is it because they're so geographically isolated that there's nobody around that poses a reasonable threat? Is it because they're able to maintain a military that protects them despite the fact that they're stagnant? 500 years seems like a really long time to just be stumbling along, refuting the possibility of entertaining any novel idea.
Yeah, so if you're good at shutting down the novel things, then you can you can shut down the stuff from within. And this isn't a period of like literally nothing is changing by any means. You have like changeover of dynasties, you have rebellions. There's like a little bit of new technology, not that much. There is a big increase in population and sort of intensification of the system they're already doing. But like for the most part, they were good at shutting down any sort of big challenges to the status quo within. They were the only game in town. They were a big, powerful empire. And, sometimes they did, like the Qing dynasty, can come in and conquer them from the north. But then they just like sort of put themselves at the top and keep running the society in kind of a similar the way that it's always been done. They're not like totally shaking things up. So even if you're losing a war and like getting this new group of people in charge, that doesn't necessarily disrupt your entire social pattern, because the new guys come in and they're like, yeah, this works pretty well. It's good to be the emperor of something like that. So they will mostly leave it intact.
What were the benefits of the system? Like, why was there so much incentive to leave such a gridlock system in place?
Because it was the biggest and richest empire in the world. It's got just, millions and millions of people, who are farming, and you can tax them. You can put together like huge armies. You can like conquer, what looks to you like the entire world, or at least all of the important parts that anyone reasonable would care about. And you can just be on top of everything. You can be the richest person, who you've ever heard of. You can be the most powerful person. And like, they were a great empire. If you look at, the art and the cultural works that was coming out of like the Ming Dynasty or something during this period of stagnation, like, it's a lot of great stuff. It's a good place to be like a rich guy who's on top. A lot of the pottery they have from that is still, I think, some of the greatest stuff that's in that medium that's been done in the history of the world. So like,
and so is it more of a oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, like even as late as the 1700s, like Adam Smith is writing about China, and he's writing that like the individuals there, like the individual farmers, are very poor. There's a phrase that the Chinese use a lot throughout history of like, oh yes, like they don't even have enough land to stick an awl in. But like Smith is writing that like, in spite of the poverty of like the individuals, the society as a whole is insanely wealthy, and like the level of infrastructure they had, like as late as the 1700s, was far beyond anything in Europe. So it's, it is stagnant in a sense, but it is huge. It is incredibly wealthy. The amount of power and resources and prestige and like cultural production that can come out of something like this. If you're looking at Rome in like 200 AD, 300 AD, it's also very stagnant, but like there's a lot going on. It's a big place, and it is still a great civilization.
Do they have, during this time period, an instrument of expansion?
Not so. They have a very. It's a very, like, it is not working well. It is very ossified. It has become an institution, to use Caroll Quigley's terms here. So they still have the institutionalized remains of, like, it looks to me like the Chinese civilization went through two successive instruments of expansion, with the first one being manorial agriculture and the second one being long-distance commerce based on the Canal network. And both of those things were still happening, but they were much more ossified. You weren't really seeing nearly as much innovation in how to increase production. They'd be like, all right, we figured out how to do these, terrace rice paddies. We're going to do more of those as we're expanding into more and more marginal land. We're still going to be doing all of this long distance commerce that really exploded during the Sung dynasty in like around 1000 AD or so. But like, this isn't going, the surplus from that is no longer going into innovations of how to do crafts and proto-industry and set up new types of iron furnaces. That stuff has all stopped. So people are still doing the things and accumulating surpluses, but you don't have the sort of engine feeding into itself and leading to, innovation and progress and expansion. Like, it has become so encumbered and ossified that it is no longer driving the same sort of thing.
Do you know of any examples where institutions have been torn down and replaced in a continuous fashion that doesn't lead to some Dark Ages gap? Like, is an institution always the end stage of a civilization?
So I don't know of cases of them being like torn down wholesale and replaced that go well. But the thing that does happen sometimes is circumvention, where the old thing is still doing, its thing, and you just start doing something new, and your new thing grows, and sort of like becomes the old, like if you look at what happened to feudalism, like there are still like dukes and earls and stuff around, like today they exist. The way that feudalism went away was not so much we're going to have a French Revolution and like, you know, it just stopped doing that super abruptly. What happened much more was there was this new commercial capitalism based on cities and guilds that just sort of grew and grew and grew, and then over time had to care about feudalism and the nobility less and less and less. And then now they're just sort of this sort of, you know, after another transition from that, the nobility is still just sort of this odd cultural holdover that doesn't really wield power anymore. And so you see in medieval Chinese history, when you see the sort of manorial landlord system eventually ossify by, I think, the late Tang Dynasty, it eventually gets circumvented, and like the really rich people start being, you know, these merchants. But it's not like they like, you know, dispossess and displace the old landlord class. It's just that this new thing ends up becoming the economic center of gravity and sort of growing beyond the old thing. So that seems to be the way that, you know, you can get a new one to arise. With it doesn't seem like it's this sort of cataclysmic revolution. It seems like you just sort of slowly grow and grow and grow, and then you sort of look behind you and you're like, you guys are still here?
You use the term manorial landlords?
Yes.
I've never heard. Can you explain what that term is?
Yeah, so a manor it's kind of a term that's mostly used in medieval European history, where you have like an agricultural, it's a little bit like a plantation. You have like the landlord living in the big house on site, and then there's a bunch of peasants living in their own little house, farming their own plot of land. And they are politically dominated by, you know, the landlord who's living in the big house, who's extracting a bunch of the crops from them. And this is, you know, a system that we're most familiar with from feudalism, where the manorial lord is a knight who's like really good at fighting. But it's a type of system where you see similar things pop up in a bunch of different societies. You know, you had the American South under slavery was pretty similar to this. This is how, you know, this is how a lot of the agricultural expansion is done in like the 600s, 700s, 800s in China. So it's a type that occurs even if the, you know, having the landlords be a knight who is really good at like riding around in horseback and stabbing people, that's less common. Certainly not how it was working in China, but the general political economic structure happens a bunch. I think that basically there are 4 types of economic instrument of expansion that have existed through time. And manorial landholding is one of the 4 that you see a bunch of the time.
What are the others?
So there is the sort of like imperial bureaucracy or big state bureaucracy, which this looks to me like it was the big thing in ancient China. If you look at like the Han Dynasty or the Warring States period, or the pharaohs of Egypt, or a lot of the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. You see these happen a lot of the time around a river valley, where you will have a state where the state is sending around, like the state has a bureaucracy which manages the irrigation works on the big river, and this is the source of the surplus. This one occurs, and then you can maybe argue that the Soviet Union was kind of similar, but with an industrial rather than a river valley sort of way. But it's an open question whether that lasted long enough that you should be considering it a civilization with an instrument of expansion. I would like to think about that more than I have. So yeah, so manorial manorial landholding, imperial bureaucracy. You've got commercial capitalism, long distance trade. So you saw this. You were mentioning the Phoenicians earlier. That was their instrument of expansion. You have in the sort of early modern period of Western civilization with, you know, a lot of the, you know, Medici families and the Fugger families and a lot of the trade in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, and then eventually with the Dutch doing the really long trade voyages to the East Indies and the British catching up to that. For a long time, that was the instrument of expansion. This is one which has recurred a bunch of times throughout history. And then the fourth one is new, is industrial capitalism, where this one depends on technologies that came into existence in, 1700s, 1800s, and is the one that we have today. But there had never been industrial capitalism before the Industrial Revolution, because what would you do it with? So those are the four that I see when I look around. And then you can arguably look at the sort of nomad pastoralism and cattle herding as a fifth, if you consider, like the Eurasian steppe nomads to be a civilization. That would be their instrument of expansion. I have gotten into some arguments about whether you should classify them this way or not. It's kind of an edge case.
Sure. Shiloh, I can tell that you're pondering.
Well, I really want to relate this to what's happening in our world today. At least it's very hard for me to talk about the world because I'm in I experience such a small part of it. But like, let's say here in America, and trying to understand what's going on, we have a number of friends who work in Silicon Valley and are working on different technologies, and also in the academy, right? And in both these places, I've heard the argument that there's a lot of stagnation appearing. And I'm wondering, I can make that case for the academy and for real scientific revolutionary ideas being less and less frequent. And when I was growing up, it was always told to me that, well, all the low-hanging fruit have been picked, and so it makes sense that things are slowing down. But the more that I worked in science, the more I started to become deeply skeptical of that idea. And I saw that a lot of innovative types were just not attracted to the kind of career where you're primarily a bureaucrat and have to beg for money with most of your time and so on and so forth. And so I wonder, like, this as a two-part question. One is, do you think that this institutionalization is playing out today? And B, do you think that the resurgence or the development of alternative institutions, or let's call them instruments of knowledge gathering in the case of the academy, or technology production in the case of Silicon Valley, are alternatives possible? Like, what are we looking at in the future? I'm asking you a little bit of a crystal ball question, but in terms of what's playing out today, how similar is that to this ossification process? And how hopeful are you about the implementation of new bridges next to the ones that are crumbling?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think it's playing out today. The way I think about this a lot is, like, I imagine some, scholar bureaucrat in the Sung dynasty in like the year 1200, and he's going around and he's saying, look, of course we had a lot of really fast technological progress and economic expansion. We figured out how to do, the canals with the locks. We built all the canals in the important places. We invented gunpowder. We invented the compass. We invented these massive iron forges. We invented these better ceramics. We figured out how to use all of the new varieties of rice, and we can get more plantings in a year. We've picked all of the low-hanging fruit. And the reason that our progress is slowing down now in 1200 AD is because the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and any further progress, you're just sort of further trying to exhaust something that is mostly exhausted already. Like, this is the same exact argument structure as the low-hanging fruit argument today. And I think it is exactly as accurate when you're looking at what are the physical possibilities. And if you look at the rate of change, like, it's the last 100 years have seen less technological and industrial progress than the 100 years before that. They've seen a lot of technological and industrial progress. It is, tied for the second fastest period of technological build out in human history. But number one was like, the like second industrial revolution, late 1800s, early 1900s. We are not progressing at the rate of inventing the internal combustion engine and electricity and flight and, antibiotics and all that. It's like it was notably faster. And I think it's because of this ongoing, like ossification, where if you look at the level of dynamism, the level of you can just go out and do things today versus 50 years ago versus 100 years ago, there's a very clear trend. It is harder to do things. There is more vetocracy. We are not at the point of, Cheng Ho's fleet being dismantled. We are on a trajectory which leads there by default, but we are not there yet. So
I think a really good optimistic story perhaps is the colonization of the moon and the program that was kind of launched by the giant bureaucratic government structure called NASA back, in the 60s. And now you see actual innovation coming from a completely separate parallel arm, right? NASA is actually contracting Elon to help him get back to the moon. And so you do see like these alternative institutions actually doing real motive force in the world.
Yes, and this is a really good example of the circumvention process I was talking about earlier, where it's not that NASA gets deposed, it's that this new thing comes and is just doing their job better than they are, and so we have rockets again. And it is important to note both that in doing this, Musk has faced a lot of political pressure, but also that it is, empirically speaking, it is a survivable amount of political pressure. There have been attempts to shut him down, and it is also important that they haven't worked. Like, he hasn't literally been thrown in jail. Like, they haven't literally dispossessed him in the way that the Ming Dynasty would have. So, it looks so. Quigley has, he's got his 7-stage model. Stage 3 is the age of expansion. That's the really good one. And then stage 4 he calls the age of conflict, which is basically where I think we are now. And the thing about being in stage 4 is that you are clearly on the trajectory towards ossification. And you are more ossified than you were in stage 3, but it is still reversible. Like, you can still circumvent it with a new instrument of expansion. And in Western history, that has happened twice before. We are on this is the third stage 4 in the history of Western civilization. And then you can either continue sort of the slow slide, and then eventually you hit stage 5, and from there, I know of no cases of it reversing once you get to that point, or you can do a circumvention. And my hope is that we will see a 4th instrument of expansion circumvent industrial capitalism and the current economic order. I don't know what it would be.
Well, isn't it like a blend of financial capitalism and digital capitalism? Because go ahead.
So financial capitalism is basically the ossified thing that is displacing industrial capitalism and locking things down. If there is a
can you elaborate on that? Because it doesn't seem transparently like an ossified version of industrial capitalism, simply because we know that in the financial world, people are constantly inventing new instruments, finding ways to repackage assets that perhaps might not be worth as much as we think that they're worth, and selling them to each other and growing the global economy and passing all these things back and forth in a way that seems quickly evolving and not necessarily ossified. To make that case.
Yes. So there's certainly a lot of, there's a sense in which there's a ton of innovation, and they are absolutely coming up with new financial instruments and deploying them all the time and making a huge amount of money on that basis. That is very certainly happening. And then when you look at what this is doing to material production of physical goods and services, the effect is much more ambiguous. Certainly there are many financial innovations which, reap profits for the people doing them and do not lead to improved material production of, the actual wealth is. So you can certainly capture surplus by doing financial capitalism. And then to go back to, the reason I like to talk about these things as the economic engine is that you need something that is sort of going back in and making it still go and making there be more material wealth, more steel, more energy, more cars, more computers, more hamburgers, whatever. And when you had, so the earlier stage of sort of when industrial capitalism was being run by these sort of entrepreneur owners, where the guy would own the factory and run the factory himself, you would see a much cleaner link between the factory owner accumulating surplus and then I'm going to expand this factory. I'm going to buy this new machine that was invented. And so the link between the accumulation of surplus and the reinvestment into the means of production is extremely clean. And the knowledge that, like the people who are deeply involved in the process and are making the decisions about how to deploy it, like they spend their time on the factory floor, they're deeply enmeshed in it, and they know how to make good decisions to boost the material production. And then when you look at financial capitalism, like there is certainly a substantial amount of finance that is very directly linked and does in fact boost production of like, oh, I'm taking out this loan to buy this machine, which like I didn't have enough like dollar bills in my pocket to buy the big expensive machine. I need to amortize it over many years. There's lots of financial instruments like this, which do in fact boost material production. There's also lots of financial instruments that don't. There's lots of financial instruments that, accumulate wealth for the financiers without having any sort of like, without causing the material production to increase, especially because of the amount of like government involvement and like basically subsidies to the financial sector that go on. And so there is a lot of financial activity that is about capturing streams of wealth from industry or capturing streams of wealth from government, but that do not end up reinvested into increasing material production. And this is a transition that's been gradually going on for about a century, like generally moving in one direction.
And so this is something that we've kind of talked about on the show before. Do you know Michael Hudson?
No.
He's an economist who's interested in the rise and fall of civilizations and how the economic underpinnings of those civilizations is what ensures their stability or not. Like he's really big on this idea of debt jubilees being really important for the stability of ancient civilizations, where you would get into this gridlock where everybody was just so in debt that nothing could happen. And so the only way that you could get out of it is by, I haven't read his work in a long time, but some ancient rulers saying, okay, all right, no more, everything is forgiven. There's some set of debts that remain, but your daily accounts with one another are settled and we're starting over again. And so he's really, really enraged with the rise of financial capitalism, specifically because of this thing that you're pointing to, which is the fact that it doesn't seem to cycle back into the society and somebody's just siphoning it off the top. And something that I haven't really been able to figure out yet is, okay, well, they're siphoning it off the top, and where does it go? Like, is it like a Smog character that's just accumulating a vault full of gold and sitting on top of it? Like, money has to be invested into somewhere in order for it to not disappear over time due to inflation.
It has to be spent somewhere. Like, so, I mean, a lot of it just gets, spent on things that are, so like, I think, so right now in America today, the amount of money that goes towards NGOs and nonprofits is greater than the amount of money that goes to manufacturing.
What?
It's insane. So, there's a lot of these billionaires who then will be like, I'm going to spend a lot of money on like having people call you while you're trying to have dinner and tell you about their political candidate. They're going to be like, people writing tendentious white papers in order to like support whatever their political views du jour are. Like a huge amount of it gets put into that, which like.
And this is through like nonprofit foundations and okay, so basically think tanks and other grant writing institutions that are distributing income for people to just serve as mouthpieces for their preferences.
It also serves as a tax break too, right? There's like a financial incentivization in the institution that's baked in as well, right?
I mean, you still lose money because you're spending much more on the thing than you get in the tax break. But it basically means that your money goes further if it is spent on this than if you spend it on yachts. People also spend a lot of money on yachts. And
let's be clear.
But like when I talk about the nonprofits, I'm talking about the entire nonprofit sector. Like this encompasses many, many things. This encompasses white papers, this encompasses political action committees, this includes food banks. Like I'm talking about like all of it lumped together is greater than all of American manufacturing lumped together.
And you're taking the baseline of, let's say, the budget of like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, like all of these massive foundations that are not just working domestically, but globally as well? Or are you just talking about their projects within the United States?
I think this was the projects within the United States. It's been a little while since I looked up this statistic, so I might be misremembering, but I think this was domestically.
It's wild. But okay, so
how many people do you personally know who work for nonprofits? And how many people do you personally know who work in manufacturing?
well, it's funny actually, because I don't think I know a single person who works for a nonprofit, but we do know a guy who works at a donut factory.
Oh, well, then I guess you're 1 to 0, so that doesn't go through.
Is this donation to nonprofits, like obviously there's a tax break, but you're saying that moreover, it's actually often going towards white papers that support your industrial motives in the first place or something like that.
Well,
How much industrial or how much institutionalized deception is at the heart of this? Like how much of it is in some sense trying to prop up the status quo by reinforcing our beliefs about how well it's doing, like we're going to have fusion power any day now, and medical pharmaceutical technology is going to keep us all from getting fat, and mathematical physics will tell us the secrets of the universe, and you could just go on with these kind of dreams that are propped up by institutional actors.
But I think
sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, I was like, surely a ton of the money is going into propping up the dreams of the industrial actors. But in terms of the original point where we started about, okay, well, where does that money go? And why is that not as effective as the previous systems of industrial capitalism? What happens is that you have somebody who's accumulating vast quantities of financial power, and then instead of putting that money into something that directly creates more wealth, whether that's jobs or some kind of industrial output, they're putting them towards these white papers. They're putting them towards this kind of soft, maybe propagandistic, maybe ideological, maybe nambly-pambly hand-holding NGO work that doesn't have this heft of a direct line between investment and effect. Like, you can't draw a line between a white paper and then the economic situation of the country getting directly better, the same way that you can when you have a guy who opens a factory and is producing something domestically and employing people and taking care of his community or whatever.
Yeah, and so the way I think of it, there's a thing you see a lot of times. You will often get the elites. There will be like some institution, some repository that's like, here's where the sort of moral people go. So in medieval Europe, the lords would be leaving huge sums of money to like the Christian monasteries. In medieval China, it was like the Buddhist monks and the Taoist monks. And I think a lot of academia and a lot of the nonprofit sector basically serves a lot of that social role and absorbs a lot of money from people who want to give away money in a way that makes them feel like virtuous people. And, certainly in the monasteries in China and in Europe, this led to incredibly bloated monasteries that were just receiving all of this wealth. And I think that the same thing is happening today in a way that they are not explicitly religious the way that many of the previous ones were, but I think the social function that they are serving and the motivations of the people who are giving the Mackenzie Bezos is, very similar, as they're giving away the giant sacks of cash to, so this, to go back to your earlier question, this is only one of the ways. I think it's a very big way that a lot of the surplus that's being accumulated is being spent on things that aren't the industry, but it is certainly not, it's not the only thing. I do think it is the one that is sort of the most culturally remarkable and is doing a lot to terraform the cultural landscape that we have.
And so where does the rest of the money go? Like, if we cannot say that financial capitalism is the next form of capitalism, like we have this manorial form, we have commercial capitalism, we have industrial capitalism, and you're like, something has to come next. And I see that financial capitalism seems to be really becoming more and more and more powerful, just in the way that everybody has their money in the stock market, everybody has a pension fund, the people that work at the big companies are rewarded with stock options. Like, everybody's playing this virtual financial game, and you're like, it can't be that which is next because it doesn't get reinvested. And so some portion of it is being frittered away into nonprofits that pad their budgets, and everybody just kind of parties the money away. Where does the rest of the money go?
I mean, a lot of it goes to just, living standards for rich people who, yachts are expensive, jets are expensive. I mean, and I would love to do like a more detailed breakdown. I think a lot of it does end up, the financial wealth, at least, gets sort of like you were saying, sort of like hoarded like smog, especially with these new sort of like, if you give the money to a foundation, then it doesn't get all of the inheritance taxes, and so a bunch of those foundations end up being a kind of dragon hoard of the money just sort of gets put in there and doesn't really get taken out. But that doesn't, like, when you have a smog hoard of just like a bunch of shares of stuff and a bunch of, it's not even a pile of gold, it's just a bunch of entries in a spreadsheet. So those just almost get removed from circulation to an extent, and like they're not directing the material production of like who gets to eat this hamburger in one direction or another. But if you're looking at the financial side of things, those are certainly a big portion of it. I would love to do like a detailed, just look at the actual number breakdown. I don't know if you probably couldn't get good data for this. I wonder how you'd look into it. That would be fascinating to just try to get a quantified look at where does all of this financial wealth go. Yeah, I wish I knew more about that than I did.
You do have like these outliers. This is the third time I brought up Elon Musk, but I think it's kind of remarkable. Whether like love him or hate him,
remarkable guy.
Yeah, he's absolutely nuts. But he is living out a different model than the one that seems like it would be occurring by default.
Yes, he's in many ways a throwback to the older sort of entrepreneur-owner model of capitalism before J.P. Morgan came in, and and like you would have a financier who would like own all of the different things without actually, knowing anything about the physical means of production. And he's been able to get insanely good results that way.
I wonder, do you think we can expect more of that in the future?
I doubt it. Like, I would love to be wrong, but it seems like the general trend is against that, and the headwinds that he is facing are like such that most people would not be able to make it through that. And I expect that they are going to only ramp up over time by default. So, like, I don't know of any cases of like the instrument, like or the ossified institution unossifies itself and goes back to being an instrument. Like, I just haven't seen that happen before historically. So I think that either the next thing will just be financial capitalism, sort of ossifying in the way that the scholar bureaucrats ossified late medieval China. I think that is a very plausible way things could go. Or there will be a circumvention of a completely new instrument, which I am not envisioning, that would pop up within, I don't know, maybe we might have another 50 or 100 years for it to come in before it's too far gone.
Is there an argument that could be made that whatever next financial instrument is coming is not necessarily going to be material in the same way that it has been in the past? Because I look at the way that, and I know that this is really speculative, but I look at the Metaverse, which people keep trying to launch, and it doesn't really catch. But I feel like the reason that it doesn't catch is because the technology for interfacing with it hasn't arrived yet. And so as soon as you have something where you can have a parallel digital world that is as inhabitable as the physical world, then all of a sudden you have this massive place where you can have a new economic system that has nothing to do with terrestrial goods. I mean, maybe it has something to do with how many GPUs you have and if whether or not you have nuclear power, but
yeah. So that's the reason why it can't go all the way. It can certainly incorporate the digital side of things. Like that can be a component of it, but like it does need to have the material output. It needs to have the energy to run it and the physical, chips to compute it. Someone needs to produce your metaverse headset and someone needs to bring it to, like, it has to, that headset has to physically go to the person who's using it. They have to go to a store, or like Amazon delivers it or whatever. Like, any system like this, the amount of material construction and distribution it needs is still very, very large, and that has to come from somewhere. So you could have something where a lot of the coordination happens in some kind of digital way, but it has to yield the material output so that people can, you know, plug their matrix thing into their spine, or like get their nutrifluid injected into their veins or whatever. Like, it still is in material reality, and that needs a bunch of stuff.
And so something that I often wonder about is whether or not automation allows for the economic system to run under its own power. Like, is it, because I don't know if you saw, there was a video that was going around Twitter the other day of a paving project in China where there were no people involved whatsoever. It was like completely autonomous. They had autonomous steamrollers, they had the cement mixer, they had the tram that brought the gravel or whatever, and there's basically the production of infrastructure, and somebody somewhere is clearly sitting in an office and has planned all of this out, and they've built the robots and everything else. But at the moment of production, once the robots are made and programmed and informed with what they're supposed to do, they kind of run autonomously. And so I sometimes wonder about whether or not we're seeing the earliest glimmers of an economic system that works basically without humans involved in it whatsoever. And this is going to sound even crazier. Once you're plugged into some kind of matrixy brain computer interface system, then all of a sudden, like, the brain's a better computational machine than any chip that you could build. It's also much cheaper than building chips. And so I'm like, this is a really creepy sci-fi universe that I've kind of created, but
I think that's a Black Mirror episode, actually.
I'm sure that it is. I'm sure that it is. But I see these things inexorably trending in this direction, where we're increasing automation, we're making progressively more and more powerful machines. People's lives are perhaps not as dopaminergic and delicious as whatever you can find in the infinite scroll of social media. And so more and more people are spending more and more time on the computer, and Neuralink is coming. And it just seems like all of these technologies are capable of summing together into this weird thing that we've never seen before, like a technological, I guess Kurzweil calls it the singularity, where it is categorically different than anything that's come before. Like, our technology is so powerful that it changes the course of events, and humans become not really the main part of civilization. It's in fact our machines that are the main part of civilization.
Yeah, it is certainly physically possible. I don't see any reason to think it's happening soon, but, like, you know, you do need the material production to be happening for the thing to keep going. There's no law of physics that says that has to be done by a human rather than a robot. There's no law of physics that says the decision to pave over here had to be made by a human in an office rather than, you know, by a computing cluster somewhere on the other side of the world. Like, you need the material output, but, like, where it comes from is like a sort of technological and engineering question, in the sense that the human body is an engineering artifact. But I don't really, I don't expect this to happen anytime in the foreseeable future, but, like, there's no law of physics that says the thing can't be done at all. And so the story of the last quarter millennium has basically been getting machines to do more and more of the things that the humans used to do. And over the last, like, 60 or so years, I would say, like, that has included a larger and larger variety of mental tasks, or at least what we would have called a mental task before the precise moment a computer started doing it. And that trend is going to continue, but it doesn't look to me like it is anywhere near the point of, like, the humans are just out of the loop. But, like, in however many hundreds of years or what have you, or if the thing just ends up going much, much faster than I'm expecting, like, it's certainly possible. There's nothing there's certainly things that are special about current humans with respect to current machines, but that is a fact about the current machines, not a law of physics.
Yeah, I mean, Shiloh always makes fun of me when I bring this up because he's like, I just don't see this happening. And I think it does seem really far-fetched and it does seem really sci-fi, but at the same point, it seems like this driving principle of the civilization that we live in, which is to create these machines that are able to do more and more and more and more and more with each churn of the wheel.
See, this goes back to what I was saying about institutional deception, though. Is like I have a really hard time with a number of these features that are promised to us by the institutions as the next expansion, right? It's like there's so many of those, from fusion to AI to pharmaceutical medicine, central banking, mathematical physics. All of these are places where we're told that just around the corner is a complete revolution in what it means to be a human in this civilization. But I wonder if there's evidence from the past of institutions making promises like this that don't ever seem to come true. I mean, they've literally been saying the fusion reactor is going to happen 10 years from now since I was born. Like, I don't remember there being a different narrative about that ever. And there's always headlines coming out like, we got it today, sort of, but it's not quite ready to go. And I just wonder if institutions are often making these kind of promises that they can't cash in on.
Yeah, the institutions make these promises, all the time. There is one of my favorite ones is, I don't know if you've ever read the Lighthill Report, is this document from the 70s where the guy is, he's talking about like, okay, so all of these people have been promising the smarter than human artificial intelligence and like a lot of the luminaries in the field, and their stuff just hasn't panned out. And like, they've got a lot of very good advances in computing. The technology is in fact better, but like the stuff they were saying about how it was, we're on track to have machines that can do everything a human can do by 1980, like it's just definitely not panning out. But it's also important to note that sometimes they make these wild promises and they just come true. And then like we do land on the moon. Or people are like, oh, don't worry about overpopulation. Our ability to make food is just going to get way better. And then it just does. And like we use, in the 70s, there's this Limits to Growth book that came out about how like, oh no, we're using exponentially more resources. We're going to run out of farmland. And because the farm yields have gone up so much, we use about the same amount of farmland to feed the human race as we did when that book came out, when the population was like a third or half of what it is now, much less. So like sometimes these things do come true and sometimes they don't. I don't really think most of the time you can predict. Some of them are like, oh, our batteries are getting 2% better a year or something like that. That sort of thing you can often be like, that's probably going to continue. But a lot of these things of like, oh, we're going to get a big breakthrough. We're going to figure out fusion. We're going to figure out, how to make the software to like think like a man. We're going to like understand what cancer is and get a general cure. Like, I think the incremental progress is fairly predictable, but the breakthroughs seem very unpredictable. Sometimes they happen, but I don't think you can tell when ahead of time. Like if I imagine that you're in the year like 1710 and like you have the concept of a steam engine somehow, I don't think you can predict from 1710 when the steam engine will come and become a big deal. Like it just, if you're looking at like the prototype of like the Newcomen steam engine, I don't think you can tell ahead of time that one's not good enough to launch the Industrial Revolution. And then you start hearing James Watt talk about the separate condenser. I really don't see how ahead of time you can be like, that's the one that's going to kick everything off. These things just don't seem knowable ahead of time.
And yet that seems to be the whole goal of trying to build artificial intelligence, as far as I can tell, right?
Yes, and it has been for many decades. And like the pattern that we've had is, you get a big burst of like the computer can now do this other thing that previously only the human brain can do, and people get really excited. And they make a bunch of progress and the software gets notably better. And then you guys know the S-curve model of technological progress where you'll have a breakthrough and like you'll get a sharp increase for a while and then it'll slow down as you tap out that particular innovation, and then sometime later you get another S-curve as someone invents something. And like as the S-curve gets tapped out, then everyone gets really disappointed in the AIs and they're like, oh man, we were promised like the God machine, and all we got was substantially better software. And then they call it an AI winter. And, it's a term that's older than I am. I forget how many AI winters there have been so far. I think there will probably be more. The current wave of, what's the large language models and the other stuff that's, been branded as artificial intelligence. Incredibly impressive software, huge deal economically. I think that a lot of it is still to be exploited. But it seems like many of the people, a year ago, 2 years ago, everyone who was at the cutting edge labs was like, oh man, like it's still going. We're still getting lots of fundamental progress. Now they seem split. A lot of them are like, oh no, we're still getting lots of fundamental progress. And a lot of them are like, the scaling is starting to peter out. It's getting slower. So it seems like we may have passed the inflection point of that particular S-curve, and just applying the stuff that's been invented in the last 5 years is going to be a huge deal. It's going to transform the world. Waymo seems like the most impressive one that's been built out so far, but I think there's a bunch of other things like that are going to come as those breakthroughs are applied. Nevertheless, it seems like the breakthroughs from this particular S-curve are likely to be petering out, and I'm not saying we will never get to the singularity world you're talking about. I'm saying it doesn't look to me like this one is going to do it on its own.
It's also that thing where a technology can become possessed by some unsavory actor, or just these corruptions build up to the point that the technology is actually working against you. Like banking was a brilliant technology at the time that it was constructed to allow for large capital projects to unfold. But if it decays to the point that there's just the financialization of everything, and that's where all of the wealth is disappearing to, it breaks down. And similarly, you could see AI, like, yeah, it could create this incredible landscape where we have all these wonderful tools to do all of our brilliant projects, but it could also just, I actually asked my kids about this at the university the other day, because I was kind of curious how they felt about the perilous state of the future with respect to AI. And I was really surprised that, unlike all of the people I've been talking to in Silicon Valley and, at the AI safety groups and so forth, my kids, by and large, were not terrified at all. They actually thought that AI was going to kind of stupidify the internet and dumb it down and make it an even more difficult place to navigate at some point, because it's so self-referential and so on and so forth. So you could see how the technologies can often not just stagnate, but actually work against progress in certain cases.
Yeah, and this has been something that people have been sort of very attentive to since basically World War I, when we were like, oh, wait a minute, we had all this technology and we'd been assuming it was like progress, but like, holy shit, what did we just do with all of this awesome technology we have? Are we going to destroy ourselves? Is this going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And we still don't have a good solution to that. It's been sort of the spiritual crisis of the Western world for the last century. Is like, what if the technology is bad this time? And I think that's a lot of sort of what is driving a lot of the sort of anxiety about a lot of different technologies is basically this. The question was asked after World War I, and there's just never been a good answer to it.
The question of what if the technology is bad this time?
Yeah, like what if, what if is the technology now enough? Is it like, as we get powerful, we can see that our technology is becoming like powerful enough to maybe destroy our society? And is this technology going, like, is the technology going to destroy the world as we know it? Are we going to, if you read them in like the 1920s, they're like, are we going to have just such a big war that everything falls apart and you can't keep having a society? And then they invent nukes and they're like, oh, wow, like maybe we could just actually blow up the entire industrial base. Or they're like, are we going to emit so much carbon that we just like literally cook everyone to death? And like, no, it's not going to be that bad, but you can certainly change the climate in ways that would not be fun. It's like, are we going to deplete all of the resources and have the big ecological collapse? Is the misinformation going to make it so no one can understand what's going on and they just become a bunch of idiots who can't run a society? Is the artificial intelligence going to become like self-directed and decide that it can achieve its goals better if there aren't humans around? Like,
well, that one I don't really buy. We've had a bunch of conversations with AI safety people, and no one can really make the case that AGI is really possible.
Or even the goal
Or
at the ground level, right? Like down in the trenches, it seems like the goal is to make more sophisticated tools for the people that can pay for them.
Yes, like, so of the people that we know that work inside of artificial intelligence, it's definitely people that are trying to actually make a machine that can replace somebody who writes emails in a solid enough way that they can sell it to a corporation. But even with the AI safety people, there's always this arc of like, okay, so you can have this machine that's intelligent and that someone can use to do evil things, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's a good point, and you can.
Long-standing problem.
But how does the machine develop its own desires in a way that it wants to get rid of the humans? And they're kind of like, well, it just does. And you're like, well, what do you mean it just does? Like, how does a machine go from doing what you tell it to do to actually producing its own internal motivations? And
I think at some point someone is going to program the motivations into the machine. There's a lot of people who just want to mess around and see what can be done. There's a bunch of people who think that, creating a successor AI is just a really cool thing to do. Like, I think there's a sort of Pandora's box thing of like, somebody is just going to think that's a neat thing to do on purpose of it. But like, I don't think the current technology, I don't think there's any reason to think it's soon. But like, if it were technologically possible, I think someone would just do it because why not?
But that is a distinctly different arc than a machine that is actually intelligent. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not really AGI in the sense of a machine that develops its own will to destroy humans. At that point, it's still somebody who's like, well, wouldn't this be fun? And then programs it into the machine. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's possible, but it seems...
I think that's the story of Frankenstein.
That's the story of Frankenstein, but it's also, yeah, you could have somebody that builds a nuclear bomb and decides to drop it on a different country and start nuclear annihilation. Like, it's
That's
not
been known to happen.
It has been known to happen, and so that's my point. Where I'm like, it doesn't seem like a dramatically different version of events than what we've always had, and I think that the AI safety argument tends to leap towards this idea of a real machine god that's uncontrollable by humans, as opposed to fulfilling the goals put into it by humans. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. But like, once the goals are in there, whether they're put into a human or they arise through some mysterious process, like, they are in there. And if the thing is just out there and pursuing its goals, like, it doesn't seem very important to me how they got in there in the first place. But that said, this seems like stuff that is pretty far away from the current technology in a way that makes it pretty useless to speculate about, because so much of it is going to depend on the particulars of the technology as it develops, and it just doesn't look to me like the current stuff is close enough that we can have a very good idea of, these sorts of things seem much more philosophically possible to me rather than like technologically possible with anything that looks like our current tech stack.
I think you're right. I think that the only point that I'm trying to make here is that the philosophical difference between the machine awakens and has goals versus humans program it to have those goals is that in one case, it's the machines you have to be scared of. In the other direction, it's the humans that you have to be watching.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually is important for us thinking about how these things arise and churn the world around them, because it's like it's the human desires that form the world, and so
which we have absolute control over. Like, it's the difference between like throwing the virgin in the volcano and just being like, well, the gods will sort of, like, what can we do, versus like, wait a second, like, we're creating these things.
Yeah, a little bit for sure. But to return to where we were earlier before we got off on this, whether or not the machine gods will take over, I feel like there is the possibility. When we were talking to Jeffrey Laddish the other day, he runs Palisade Research, which is like an AI safety org in the Bay.
Yeah, I know Jeffrey. We used to work together a while ago. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we haven't released it yet. I think you guys we might release your episodes together next week. So
that'd be sweet.
But when we were talking to him, it seemed like the thing that was really most frightening was this idea of complete stagnation. Like, we create a society that has an artificial intelligence bureaucracy that is this institutional framework that nothing can ever break out of again. And that to me seems like a real possibility, because if the arc of civilization is that you get to the point where an instrument becomes an institution, it seems like we're on the cusp of that, where even if we don't fulfill the promise of highly intelligent AI that has its own goals and motivations or whatever, we still fulfill the goal of having these really comprehensive tools that become the status quo that no one can get out from under because they just manage everything.
Yeah, and I think you absolutely could get something like that lasting for centuries. I don't think you would get one that is literally permanent, because just like everything is fragile, everything decays, everything changes. But like, it could last for a really long time, and that would be extremely bad.
And I think that in terms of civilizational progress and the things that we can learn from the past, it's maybe the most important thing is to not create a tool that can ossify like that. To avoid it as much as possible, to just put in some sort of safeguard so that if it starts to become too powerful, you have some way of getting around it. And I don't think that we've really done a lot of work in figuring out what that looks like, because we've come to take for granted that that instruments develop, they turn into institutions, we come up with other ones, but we haven't really had a lot of experience with getting out from underneath institutions in this really directed, highly aware way, which I think is possible.
Can it be done constitutionally? Can you actually build these safeguards ahead of time? Could the founding fathers of this country have foreseen the corporatization and the corruption that was inevitable that we're seeing today?
Or could the the medieval Chinese have prevented it from stagnating?
Yeah, and so I think that the thing to do about this action is very different. I disagree pretty strongly with the approach you were talking about there, because like it seems like, especially since, the world wars and the sort of like, oh my God, are we going to get too powerful and destroy everything? There's been this big trend of like, okay, so we have to find the potential dangers and just remove all of the power from all of the places that power is, because something could go wrong with it. And I just don't think that works. Like the power, to the extent, like the power has to go somewhere, or like either it goes somewhere or it doesn't. And if it doesn't go somewhere, then it's just sort of removed, and there's just less human control over what's going on, and it's just more ossified and more drifting. And the sort of impulse to, we have to make sure this thing can't be too powerful, it can't do the bad thing, has resulted in, like, it's one of the big factors behind the ossification and the lack of human control over what's happening in the world. I think that the thing that has historically worked well is not, okay, what if we just denature everything and remove all the power from things so that it can't go wrong, so that it can't lock it down? Is, you brought up the founding fathers, like they're not trying to make it so there isn't power. They're trying to make it so there's a bunch of different power centers that balance each other. It's not like, okay, we have to make sure this thing can't ossify. Everything will ossify. Everything in history has ossified. That isn't changing today. It's, you have to have a setup where new things can arise and circumvent and displace the old things. So as the old thing ossifies, it will ossify. This happens to everything. And
but it's weird, like
they set up where it can be surpassed, and that doesn't take down the whole society.
Right. So I'm pointing to, I wonder if the founding fathers could have written a line into the Constitution that was like, hey, we're going to need a new one of these things 300 years from now, for sure. There's no way that this founding document is going to make any sense at some point.
Yeah, I think it was Jefferson who wanted a new one with every, like, every generation, every 40 years or so. Like, she was like, because of, it would ossify, and it did. And I think that his approach would have been stronger in that direction than I would have preferred. With the whole, tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of tyrants approach. But like, you can see where he's coming from. And, this is why they put in the ability to amend the Constitution. And it's kind of a tragedy that we've lost that social technology. And how long has it been? Like 40, 50 years or something since the last time an amendment was passed, but like that's a bad sign.
Agreed.
So do you think though we're doomed?
I don't think we're doomed. I think that the default trajectory is so basically. I think that we will. I think it is either there's a fork in the road over the next 50-ish years of either stagnation, which would then lock in, or circumvention and revival. And I think both of those are very plausible, and I think one of the two will happen.
Do you have a framework for what the circumvention and revival looks like, or is it still caught on this idea where you don't necessarily know what follows industrial capitalism?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't think I know. Like, I've been trying to look around and find one. I don't, I don't think it's necessarily unknowable at all. But like, I have not been able to see one when I've been looking around. It's something I still think about and try to keep an eye out for.
What happens in the Chinese history books when the parallel of the financialization process happens?
Yeah, so I know much more about the expansionary period than about the stagnant period. This is something I need to read a lot more about. So my provisional picture is that it's the scholar bureaucrat class of, they take the civil service exam and then they become appointed to some administrator post. These people seem like the ones who are like siphoning off a lot of the surplus and shutting down any potential new power center seems to be where most of it happens. But like, I need to read more about that period because I just know a lot more about like 600 to 1200 than I do about 1200 to 1900.
I was going to say, do you think that there's something in those histories that you can glean and forge into a model of what a circumventing future looks like? Or do you think that the only lessons that we can learn from empires that have died is the various ways in which they have died?
I think, the fact of circumvention and that possibility is a very important thing that I think I've learned from looking at this. And I don't know, it's kind of a trickier situation because, one of my theories is that there's the 4 types of instrument of expansion, and I don't think that any of the other 3 would do a good job of like running an economy like the one we have now. So I don't really see anything historically that looks like a good model other than industrial capitalism, which is like how we got into this mess. And I don't think you can circumvent it with itself, even if I do feel more optimistic about younger civilizations using the same instrument and like just being at an earlier stage. So they've got, the whole period of expansion ahead of them. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of drawing lessons from history is always depends a lot on the specifics because it's not a matter of like it depends a lot more on like, oh, we have learned from watching the Japanese industrial policy in the 70s that this structure of tariff actually works really well. You get much more useful stuff like that and much less of it is much harder to get actionable things you can do from looking at this sort of like macro history. Here's how it goes over 1,000 years. Maybe you're 100 years too early for the intervention. Maybe you're 100 years too late. That stuff is much harder to actually apply lessons to than when you're getting closer in.
That makes a lot of sense. And so looking at the immediate near future, are there interventions that you think are absolutely necessary in order to nudge us towards the right path?
I think that, is that good? Yeah, just continuing to push against the sort of ossification and vetocracy wherever it's possible. And especially when there is a new exciting thing that is around, like nurture the new seeds of anything. Like if there is a new economic thing that seems like it has some sort of potential and you don't really know where it's going to go. Like I feel quite excited about a lot of the current artificial intelligence stuff because it is an expansionary thing and a new power base that I don't know where it's going to go. And many of these things lead to same old, and just like people get a little bit richer. That's great. Many of them just sort of peter out and lead nowhere in particular. Some of them end up becoming the foundation of a new thing. So just new ideas, new social movements, new small economic engines. Like where I see a new underdog arising, like I basically just always want them to grow and to win, because so much of where the progress comes from is you just get a bunch of these gonzo things popping up and doing their own thing. And like a very small fraction of them end up being the ones that are really onto something that like grow and circumvent by virtue of just being better on their own terms. So I try to nurture all types of stuff like that, even if, I don't really understand the kids these days, and it doesn't, like, I'm clearly out of touch and missing something. I'm just like, that's a good sign, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we had Andres Gomez-Emilson on the show, who runs the Qualia Research Institute down in the Bay. And he had this...
I love their work, and I don't understand it in the slightest.
Well, he had this really fascinating frame of team replicator versus team consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Where he's like, people go into these DMT experiences, and when you get sufficiently deep into it, you end up in a place that's very geometric. And so your entire reality is tiled with these geometric patterns. And there's certain types of patterns that are replicator patterns where...
Personified.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time really parsing whether or not it's like a full creature or something, but they move around and they touch other things. And when they touch those other things, they transform the thing that they've touched into some version of themselves. And so once one of these replicators appears, it just goes around, and it's possible to have your entire visual field become homogeneous and uniform and get taken over by this entity.
Huh.
But he describes it almost like this universal battle, that's this cosmic battle that's occurring everywhere all the time.
Where on one hand you have team replicator, which is the thing that makes everything like itself. And on the other hand, you have team consciousness, which is the vibrant ecosystem of multiple different kinds of things that are all creating different patterns and playing with each other and keeping this uniform kludge at bay.
Right. And, as the Greeks would remind us, you need both of these in balance in order to have things working well. And I think that our current society has trended a couple of clicks too far towards the replicators, if I'm understanding the framework right. But
it certainly seems
you'd kind of want to move it back to the middle rather than all the way, you don't want to the other end of the pendulum.
Yes.
And it's fascinating because all of the mythologies from these ancient civilizations seem to emphasize the balance between forces in general, which is something that I feel like we've perhaps lost sight of, in that we don't really have a central mythology in our modern civilization. Like we didn't even get into how mythologies reinforce the framework for a civilization, but they definitely seem to. And I worry that
I wish I understood better than I do, because like I can tell that spiritual power is a real thing, but I don't have a theory of how it works the way I do for like economics or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or like political power. I understand that mechanistically a lot better than I do like the mythological forces.
The word spiritual is just very difficult to bring into an intellectual setting in general, because it's kind of a trump card, right? It means lots of different things depending on what you're talking about, who's talking about it. Like the inability oftentimes of people to define their key terms when we get to something like spiritual makes it problematic. But at the same time, I don't see how a civilization can persist without a central mythological framework that reinforces its ongoings. It just it doesn't make sense to me. And it seems in some sense that it leads to endless fracturing of the peoples otherwise. There's some glue, some glue to it that's really vital.
Yeah, because I feel like if we're talking about a really stagnant civilization where the upper echelon is relatively rich, but the lowest echelon doesn't have enough land to stick an awl into, as you said earlier, something else must be keeping it stable. Like there has to be some sort of faith-based practice that is ensuring that the people that have nothing don't rise up against it. And that's operating likely in the background, and yet is central to its success.
Well, it's funny because like a lot of civilizations, they literally make their state leaders uphold. They basically pretend like they are the deities, and if they stop acting like the deities, then they get rid of them, right? So it's almost like holding them to this absolute highest ideal, in a sense, which seems to keep things on track.
Yeah, the Chinese emperors were often referred to as the son of heaven, with heaven, being an English term for Tian, which doesn't translate super well, but it's not like, this way up in the sky with like everyone playing harps. It's much more like the natural order working the way that it should.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more of a Taoist concept.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I guess the idea that, your position in life is decided by the fact that this is just the natural order of things. Oh, this is what, we talked when we had our pre-show very lightly about David Graeber. And you're like, Graeber doesn't really have the robust scholarship that warrants deeper consideration, but he does say something really interesting in The Dawn of Everything, where he talks about the fact that the idea of inequality, the way that we conceive of it, didn't even cross people's mind at some point as being something to think about. Like,
it's very recent historically.
He's like, if you go and look at medieval European texts, there's no sense of, why does the peasant have nothing and the king have everything? There's no analysis of the fact that society is striated. It's the sense of, well, obviously it's striated. Like, this is the natural order of things.
Oh, and partly that's because, as you were saying earlier, it's written by all of the kings and the dukes and the people being funded by the dukes. But also it is notable that today, like, our dukes and the people they fund do talk about inequality. So that is a real difference.
Yeah, but it seems also a little bit like lip service.
Partly, but like, I think it was much so in general, Karl Marx was, when he was writing, he was like, oh man, look at all of this intolerable misery and poverty. It's going to, yield a collapse and revolutions. And then in the earlier 20th century, that was mostly headed off by, people sort of, the powers that be sort of looking at the general Marxist critiques and being like, oh yeah, like, we need to do welfare partly because it's humane and partly because if we have that type of social safety net, then like we are not going to get a Russian Revolution over here. And so it's sort of like, okay, we don't want that sort of Oliver Twist freezing to death in your apartment thing, both on the merits and as a like, we will have a social safety net, which is in fact better than trying to have a revolution. And so it's going to like that sort of like, social democracy, capitalism with enough transfer payments that the sort of worst of it is avoided is in fact much more stable than, the previous version before all of that was instituted.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a good point. That's fair.
I wanted to ask you real quick about your methods before we let you go, because I've often tried to bring I've tried to look into Eastern Chinese history to bring it into my astronomy series, looking back across the ages, and I've just found it really impenetrable. And I don't know if it's the language barrier. How do you navigate that? How are you digging into the Chinese history? Is it easier than I think?
Yeah, so it's not trivial to find sources because I don't read Chinese. The robots are not yet good enough to translate it reliably. They still make some things up. And so much of the Western scholarship on it is pretty bad. So basically, I had to do a lot of bibliography crawling and like I'll get something and see who they're citing and check those things out and sort of briefly glance at and skim a bunch of things before I was able to find some good ones. It just like basically just do a breadth first search until you get some that are like actually solid. And then once you had a few good ones, they tend to cite other good ones. So the bibliography crawling sort of got more productive from that point. So I found that for the economic history in particular is what I've mostly looked at. most of the best English language work was done in the middle of the 20th century. It's generally been, since then, most of it has been sort of rehashes of like, Needham and Twitchett and a bunch of those guys. And there's been very little new work that I feel has been like genuinely adding to that, at least within the English language tradition. I have no idea what's going on in the Chinese language. So yeah, it definitely took a while wading through before I could find the ones that I felt like, okay, like I actually trust this person's analysis. They are themselves flying to China and reading the archives in Chinese. They know what the hell they're talking about. And like, Joseph Needham's, he has this massive, I don't even know how many volumes, Science and Civilization in China. And he's like taking the train to photograph the site of the ancient canal. And I'm like, this guy's the real thing. So.
Oh man, we didn't get to talk about canals. What is there anything that we absolutely can't leave without knowing about the canal
in
system?
the next 5 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, we got to let you go in a second.
Very, very briefly, they basically just, by like, throughout the 600s, 700s, they just made pretty much an interstate highway system of canals that connected all of the major population centers. So this was the foundation of agriculture, was the irrigation from the canals, the transport, like this formed the backbone of, this was where most of the commerce was done for, when their second instrument of expansion, when it was long distance trade, it was mostly by boats going on the canals. You could go from most any population center to any other population center in a way that like the Europeans don't get anything like this until like 1100 years later or something in the 1700s. They start building out, similar scale canals. But if you look at the Grand Canal of like, which was connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, it's like, I consider it to be the most impressive human construction before the industrial era that's ever been done. It's just absolutely massive, totally transforms the political geography. Now they can ship tax grain from the south up to the capital in the north and like, feed the troops to fight the horse barbarians. Like, you couldn't really have China as a unified political entity without this canal. Mm-hmm. And there's just an incredible profusion of little branches going to every little town.
That's fascinating. All right, I'm gonna have to read about that on my own.
All right, next time, Chinese canals and the power of infrastructure.
Yeah, so we gotta let
Chao Ting has a wonderful book on, I forget the name of it, about the canals. Yeah,
nice.
Check it out. Before we let you go, where can people find you? Where are you publishing all your findings?
Yeah, so I'm writing at benlandautaylor.com. I publish on, a variety of topics, largely industry, but whatever I'm thinking about this week or so. And then I'm on Twitter at benlandautaylor. So those are the two places where, anything I do will get announced on one or the other.
And then are you still writing for Bismarck?
Yes. So that's, my day job is with Bismarck analysis, do a lot of institutional analysis, looking into particular organizations. The client wants to know, how does this, company or that government agency or this nonprofit, how does it really work on the inside? We'll come in and do that. Lately, I've been doing a bunch of the writing for and the research for our Bismark Brief, as our paid newsletter, where every week we're going to look into some company or institution or a live player and like give the basic story of how it fits into the world and the political economy. So that's been a ton of fun.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for coming and for shining a little bit of light on the arc of civilization and perhaps a little bit of the path forward. I hope.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. This was a good time.
I hope we get the chance to talk again.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Have a good rest of your day, sir.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, folks.